Hey everyone, tonight we journey into one of history's most provocative mysteries, where ancient clay tablets meet cosmic speculation, where the gods of Mesopotamia supposedly left fingerprints on a distant red planet, and where the line between archaeology and imagination becomes beautifully, maddeningly blurred. So before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what we explore here together. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. It's always fascinating to see our community stretching across time zones and continents. Now settle in, dim those lights, maybe turn on some soft background noise, and let's ease into tonight's exploration together. We're diving into one of the most controversial topics in alternative history, the claim that ancient Sumerian texts contain evidence of extraterrestrial bases on Mars, specifically attributed to beings called the Anunnaki. It's a theory that has captivated millions, launched countless books and documentaries, and divided scholars into camps of fierce believers and equally fierce skeptics. But here's what makes this journey worthwhile. Whether you accept the conclusions or not, the path takes us through genuine ancient history, real archaeological discoveries, and the fascinating question of how we interpret texts written 5,000 years ago in a language most of us will never read. The story begins not in space, but in the desert sands of ancient Iraq, in the cradle of civilization itself. Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, where humanity first learned to write, build cities, and record its myths for eternity. The Sumerians emerged around 4,500 BCE in southern Mesopotamia, creating what many consider the world's first true civilization. They invented cuneiform writing, the wheel, complex irrigation systems, and urban planning. Their cities Uruk-ur, Eridu, Nippur, rose from the marshlands like monuments to human ambition, each one a testament to organized society, specialized labor, and centralized government. But the Sumerians didn't just build, they wrote, and what they wrote has survived in fragments, thousands upon thousands of clay tablets baked hard by time and climate, preserving knowledge that would otherwise have vanished into dust. These tablets contain everything from mundane accounting records, how many bushels of grain, how many sheep, to profound religious texts, creation myths, hymns to gods, and epic poems that would influence literature for millennia. Among these writings appear the Anunnaki, a term that literally translates to something like those who came from heaven to earth, or offspring of Anu, Anu being the supreme sky god in the Sumerian pantheon. The Anunnaki appear throughout Sumerian, Akkadian, Assyrian, and Babylonian texts, spanning nearly 3,000 years of Mesopotamian civilization. In the earliest Sumerian texts, they're described as a group of deities, the children and descendants of An, the god of heaven, and Ki, the goddess of earth. They're numerous, sometimes counted as 50, sometimes as 7 great gods who decree fate, and they govern various aspects of the cosmos and human existence. The texts describe them as powerful beings who judged the dead, who controlled the elements, who decided the fates of cities and kings. In the famous creation epic, the Enuma Elish, which dates to around 1200 BCE but draws on much older traditions, the Anunnaki appear as lesser gods who serve the higher deities, who toil and labor until humanity is created specifically to take over their work. This is the authentic, academically accepted understanding of the Anunnaki, based on primary source material and scholarly consensus. They are gods, members of the Mesopotamian pantheon, supernatural beings who exist in myth and religious belief, not physical visitors from another world. The tablets describe them using the language of divinity, not technology. They wield lightning and storms, not spacecraft. They reside in temples and cosmic realms, not bases on Mars. Understanding this foundation is crucial before we explore how alternative interpretations transformed these ancient gods into something else entirely, something that launches us from the deserts of Iraq into the far reaches of the solar system. So how did we get from Sumerian deities to alleged alien bases on Mars? The transformation didn't happen overnight, and it didn't emerge from ancient texts alone. Instead, it required a modern lens, a particular way of reading these ancient stories that assumes our ancestors were describing literal events but lack the vocabulary to properly explain advanced technology. Enter Zecharia Sitchin, the man who would become the most influential voice in reinterpreting Sumerian mythology through what he called a literal reading of the texts. Sitchin was born in Russia in 1920, raised in Palestine, and later settled in New York, where he worked as a journalist and executive in the shipping industry. He had no formal training in Assyriology, the academic discipline that studies ancient Mesopotamia, nor in linguistics, archaeology, or ancient Near Eastern studies. What he did have was a passion for ancient texts, a working knowledge of modern Hebrew, and an unshakable conviction that previous scholars had fundamentally misunderstood what the Sumerians were trying to tell us. In 1976, he published the first book in what would become his Earth Chronicles series, The 12th Planet, and in doing so, he launched a revolution in alternative archaeology that continues to this day. Sitchin's core thesis was deceptively simple but staggeringly ambitious. He claimed that the Anunnaki were not gods at all, but rather extraterrestrial beings from a planet called Nibiru, a massive world on a 3,600-year elliptical orbit around our Sun. According to Sitchin's interpretation of Sumerian texts, these beings came to Earth roughly 450,000 years ago with a specific mission: to mine gold from our planet to save their own atmosphere. The gold, he claimed, was needed to create a protective shield around Nibiru, suspended as fine particles in their stratosphere to prevent their world from losing heat and becoming uninhabitable. The Anunnaki established mining operations on Earth, initially working the mines themselves, but eventually growing weary of the brutal labor. In Sitchin's narrative, the Anunnaki then performed a genetic engineering experiment, taking the DNA of Homo erectus, the hominid species that existed on Earth at the time, and combining it with their own genetic material to create Homo sapiens, modern humanity. We were designed as a slave species, workers to toil in the gold mines so the Anunnaki could return to their administrative duties and comfortable lives. This creation, according to Sitchin's reading of texts like the Atrahasis epic and the Enuma Elish, explained both human origins and the presence of technologically advanced beings in ancient mythology. Every reference to gods descending from heaven became spacecraft landings. Every divine weapon became advanced technology. Every temple became a base of operations. Sitchin supported his claims by reinterpreting Sumerian cuneiform, particularly cylinder seal VA-243, which he claimed depicted our solar system with all the planets correctly shown, including Nibiru as a large planet between Mars and Jupiter. He pointed to the Sumerian word Anunnaki itself, arguing it meant those who from heaven came, a description he took literally as space travel. He examined references to the Abzu, often translated as the deep or the underground freshwater ocean in Sumerian cosmology, and reinterpreted it as a mining site in Southeast Africa, specifically in the gold-rich regions of modern Zimbabwe and South Africa. He claimed that place names in Africa, terms in various languages, and genetic markers in human DNA all pointed back to this ancient intervention. The Mars connection entered Sitchin's narrative in his later books, particularly The Lost Realms and Genesis Revisited. He proposed that the Anunnaki didn't just operate on Earth, but maintained bases throughout the solar system, with Mars serving as a way station, a stopping point between Nibiru's distant orbit and Earth. He pointed to features on Mars that some have interpreted as artificial structures, particularly the famous face on Mars in the Cydonia region, photographed by Viking 1 in 1976, the same year the 12th Planet was published. Sitchin suggested that these structures, along with what he interpreted as pyramidal formations, were remnants of Anunnaki architecture, evidence that Mars had once been inhabited and used as part of their interplanetary infrastructure. He also reinterpreted astronomical references in Sumerian texts, arguing that descriptions of celestial bodies and cosmic events were actually ancient records of planetary catastrophes, encounters between Nibiru and other worlds during its periodic passages through the inner solar system. He claimed the asteroid belt was the remains of a planet the Sumerians called Tiamat, destroyed in a cosmic collision with Nibiru or one of its moons, an event recorded in the Enuma Elish's dramatic descriptions of Marduk battling the chaos dragon Tiamat. In Sitchin's view, this wasn't mythology but astronomy, ancient humanity's attempt to preserve knowledge of real cosmic events they had witnessed or been told about by the Anunnaki. To support the Mars theory specifically, Sitchin and his followers pointed to several elements in Sumerian texts and imagery. First, there are references to the god Nergal, associated with Mars in later Babylonian astronomy, who rules over the underworld and is described in some texts as having descended from heaven. In Sitchin's interpretation, this described Mars as a way station or temporary residence for Anunnaki, travelling between Nibiru and Earth. Second, there are descriptions in various Mesopotamian texts of divine journeys through the heavens, celestial palaces, and cosmic battles, all of which Sitchin read as accounts of space travel and conflicts between different Anunnaki factions operating on different worlds. Third, and perhaps most compellingly for believers in the theory, there are references to the number 7 in relation to planets and cosmic structure. Ancient Mesopotamian astronomy recognized 5 visible planets plus the sun and moon as 7 celestial bodies, but Sitchin argued that texts sometimes refer to additional planets or divine spheres, which he interpreted as knowledge of the outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, which weren't discovered by modern astronomy until the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries respectively. If ancient Sumerians knew about these distant worlds, Sitchin argued, someone must have told them. Someone who'd been there, someone like spacefaring Anunnaki. The appeal of Sitchin's theories is undeniable. They offer a grand unified theory of human origins, ancient mysteries, religious mythology, and space exploration, all wrapped into one compelling narrative. They suggest that the great monuments of antiquity, the pyramids, the megalithic structures of South America, the precise astronomical knowledge of ancient cultures weren't products of primitive people making do with stone tools, but rather evidence of advanced intervention, guidance, or even direct construction by technologically superior beings. They propose that the seemingly impossible achievements of ancient civilizations become possible, even obvious, once we admit that humans had help. Teachers from the stars who jump-started our civilization before departing back to their distant homeworld. But here's where we need to pause and examine the actual evidence, because extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof, and the foundation of the Anunnaki Mars-based theory rests entirely on how we interpret ancient texts and archaeological findings. So let's look at what the Sumerian tablets actually say, what academic scholars who dedicate their lives to translating cuneiform have concluded, and where Sitchin's interpretations diverge from mainstream understanding. This matters not to dismiss the theory out of hand, but to establish what we know versus what we speculate, what's written in ancient clay versus what's written into it by modern interpretation. The Sumerian language died out as a spoken tongue around 2000 BCE, replaced by Akkadian, though it continued to be used as a scholarly and religious language, much like Latin in medieval Europe, for another 1500 years. Modern understanding of Sumerian came from the work of 19th and 20th century scholars who painstakingly deciphered cuneiform writing, comparing texts in multiple languages, using bilingual inscriptions, and developing dictionaries and grammars through decades of collaborative research. The Pennsylvania Sumerian Dictionary, the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature, and similar academic resources represent hundreds of scholars working together to understand this ancient language with as much accuracy as possible. When these scholars translate texts mentioning the Anunnaki, they consistently render the term as referring to gods, divine beings within the Mesopotamian pantheon. The word breaks down as a combination of Anu, the name of the sky god, and a term relating to offspring or descendants. The Anunnaki are the divine family, the gods collectively, or sometimes more specifically the gods who judge the dead in the underworld. In the Descent of Inanna, one of the oldest and most important Sumerian myths, the Anunnaki are described as sitting in judgment, 7 gods who fix the decrees of fate. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, they appear as divine judges and as beings who control cosmic forces like the flood. The key mythological text that Sitchin reinterprets most dramatically is the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic. In the standard academic translation, this text describes the creation of the world from primordial chaos. Apsu, the freshwater ocean, and Tiamat, the saltwater ocean, mingle their waters and give birth to generations of gods. These younger gods become noisy and disruptive, and Apsu plans to destroy them so he can have peace and quiet. The god Ea kills Apsu, and Tiamat, enraged, creates an army of monsters to avenge her consort. Marduk, Ea's son, volunteers to fight Tiamat if the gods will make him their king. They agree, and Marduk battles Tiamat, killing her by shooting an arrow down her throat when she opens her mouth to swallow him. He then splits her corpse in half, using one half to create the sky and the other to create the earth. From the blood of Tiamat's general, Kingu, Marduk creates humanity to serve the gods. This is mythology, creation story, theogony explaining how the gods came to be organized with Marduk, the patron god of Babylon, at the head. Its political theology, justifying Babylon's supremacy by elevating their god above older Sumerian deities, its cosmogony, explaining the structure of the universe using the symbolic language of divine conflict and primordial waters. What it is not, according to mainstream scholarship, is a literal account of planetary collisions, space battles, or genetic engineering. The text uses metaphor, symbol, and narrative patterns common to ancient Near Eastern mythology. Tiamat is described as a dragon, a serpent, a creature with claws and scales, not as a planet. Marduk wields winds and storms, not spacecraft or advanced weapons. But Sitchin read this text completely differently. He took Tiamat to be a planet that once existed between Mars and Jupiter. He interpreted Marduk as Nibiru, or possibly as an Anunnaki leader using advanced technology. The battle between Marduk and Tiamat became a cosmic collision when Nibiru passed through the inner solar system, its gravitational forces or actual physical impact destroying Tiamat and creating both Earth and the asteroid belt from the debris. The monsters Tiamat creates became moons, the waters of Tiamat became Earth's oceans, and the entire mythological narrative became ancient astronomy recorded in symbolic language, because ancient humans lacked scientific terminology. Here we encounter the fundamental methodological difference between Sitchin's approach and academic scholarship. Sitchin claimed to be reading the texts literally, but in practice he was reading them selectively and symbolically, choosing which elements to take at face value and which to reinterpret through a modern lens. When the text says Marduk shot an arrow, Sitchin doesn't accept that literally, instead proposing it describes a weapon or energy beam. When the text says Tiamat was a dragon with blood and a corpse, Sitchin doesn't accept that literally, instead proposing it describes a planet. He applies literalism inconsistently wherever it supports his thesis, and symbolism wherever literalism would undermine it. Moreover, academic translators point out that Sitchin frequently mistranslated or misread Sumerian and Akkadian terms. The word Anunnaki, for instance, does not mean those who from heaven to earth came in any standard grammatical analysis of Sumerian. The cylinder seal VA 243, which Sitchin claimed showed all the planets of the solar system plus Nibiru, actually depicts a star, probably representing the god Shamash the sun, surrounded by various celestial symbols that don't correspond to planets in any systematic way. Ancient Mesopotamian astronomical texts, of which many survive, describe 5 planets: Venus, Mercury, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, the ones visible to the naked eye. They don't describe Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, or a mysterious 12th planet on an elliptical 3,600-year orbit. The astronomical knowledge of the Sumerians and Babylonians was impressive but not impossible, the result of centuries of careful observation, record-keeping, and mathematical modelling, not extraterrestrial instruction. The notion that ancient Mesopotamians couldn't have achieved their astronomical knowledge without alien help also underestimates human capability. The Babylonians could predict lunar eclipses, track planetary positions, and develop mathematical systems sophisticated enough that we still use elements of them today, like the 60-minute hour and the 360-degree circle. They did this the same way every civilization develops knowledge, through observation, experimentation, transmission of information across generations, and the occasional brilliant insight by individual thinkers. They made errors too, believing the Earth was flat and covered by a solid dome, that the sun and moon would have complete explanation requires accepting premises that lack solid evidence. Let's examine some of these genuine mysteries that the Anunnaki theory attempts to explain. The construction of the Great Pyramid of Giza remains partially mysterious in terms of specific techniques, though engineers and archaeologists have proposed numerous plausible methods using period-appropriate technology. The precision of the construction is remarkable, but not impossible for human workers with time, organization, and skill. Similarly, the ancient Nazca lines in Peru, massive geoglyphs visible only from the air, seem mysterious until we remember that they're perfectly visible from nearby hills and that ancient peoples were capable of scaling up designs using ropes, stakes, and careful measurement. The fact that we can see them best from aircraft is a coincidence, not evidence that they were meant to be seen from spacecraft. The ancient Antikythera mechanism, a complex bronze device from ancient Greece capable of predicting astronomical positions and eclipses, demonstrates that ancient technology could be remarkably sophisticated. But we understand how it works. It's mechanical, made with techniques available to ancient craftsmen, based on astronomical observations and mathematical models developed over centuries. It's not alien technology, it's human ingenuity. The fact that it's unique among surviving artifacts tells us more about what gets preserved versus what gets destroyed over 2,000 years than about how advanced ancient Greeks actually were. How many other sophisticated devices existed but corroded away because they weren't lucky enough to sink in just the right type of seabed to preserve them? Ancient knowledge of astronomy provides another example. The Dogon people of Mali have traditional knowledge about Sirius being a binary star system, which wasn't confirmed by modern astronomy until the 20th century. Ancient astronaut theorists point to this as evidence of alien contact, but anthropological research suggests the Dogon learned this from French astronomers who visited the region in the early 20th century, and that the myth about ancient knowledge was actually a misunderstanding by Western anthropologists who didn't properly account for cultural exchange and the evolution of oral traditions. The mystery dissolves when we do proper historical research, instead of assuming the first extraordinary explanation we encounter must be correct. The same pattern appears throughout alternative archaeology. A genuine mystery exists. Mainstream scholars offer various explanations acknowledging uncertainty. Alternative theorists propose alien intervention as a comprehensive solution, and believers accept the alternative without examining whether it actually fits the evidence better or just feels more exciting. This isn't to mock anyone who finds these theories appealing, but rather to highlight how we evaluate competing explanations. The scientific method requires that we prefer explanations based on known physics, observed evidence, and logical parsimony over explanations that require accepting entirely new categories of entities, beings or phenomena for which we have no independent evidence. In the case of Sumerian texts and Mars bases, accepting the theory requires believing that ancient Mesopotamians had contact with extraterrestrial beings, that these beings had the technology for interstellar or at least interplanetary travel, that they needed gold from Earth for reasons that don't align with physics, that they genetically engineered humans in ways that left no genetic signature, that they built bases on Mars that have completely vanished, and that they recorded all of this in mythological texts that mainstream scholars have consistently misunderstood for over a century. Each of these propositions is individually extraordinary, and collectively they demand overwhelming evidence, not simply reinterpretations of ambiguous ancient texts and natural rock formations on Mars. Meanwhile, the mainstream explanation requires only that we accept what we already know to be true, that ancient civilizations developed religious mythologies explaining their world through stories of gods and cosmic events, that these mythologies use symbolic language and metaphor, that the Sumerians were sophisticated observers of the sky, who tracked planets and stars without understanding them as physical worlds, and that modern people sometimes project their own cultural concerns like space travel and genetic engineering onto ancient texts that were addressing entirely different questions. This explanation doesn't require aliens, space travel, conspiracy or cover-ups, just human nature operating the way it always has. But even after examining the evidence and finding the Anunnaki Mars base theory lacking in scientific support, we shouldn't dismiss the underlying questions it raises about human origins, ancient knowledge, and the possibility of extraterrestrial life. These are legitimate questions that science takes seriously, even if the specific Anunnaki narrative doesn't hold up under scrutiny. The origin of life on Earth is still being investigated, with theories ranging from chemical evolution in primordial soup to panspermia, the idea that organic compounds or even simple life forms arrived from space on meteorites. Neither of these theories requires intelligent aliens, but they do acknowledge that Earth isn't isolated from cosmic processes. The search for extraterrestrial intelligence, SETI, represents mainstream science's acknowledgement that alien life could exist and that we should look for it using radio telescopes and other instruments. The discovery of thousands of exoplanets, planets orbiting other stars, has revealed that planetary systems are common and that many planets exist in the habitable zones where liquid water could exist. The building blocks of life, amino acids and organic molecules, have been found in meteorites and detected in interstellar clouds. Life might be common in the universe, and if so, some of it might be intelligent and technological. But finding alien microbes on Mars or detecting radio signals from a distant civilization would be fundamentally different from proving that aliens visited Earth in ancient times, built bases on Mars, and genetically engineered humanity. The evidentiary standards are completely different. A microbe fossil on Mars just needs to be demonstrably biological and Martian, confirmed through multiple independent analyses. An ancient alien visitation claim requires artifacts, structures, genetic evidence, textual evidence that survives scholarly scrutiny, and some explanation for why the evidence isn't obvious and abundant. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and reinterpreted mythology simply doesn't meet that standard. Let's turn now to the cultural impact of the Anunnaki Mars theory and why it matters beyond questions of historical accuracy. Sitchin's books have sold millions of copies, been translated into dozens of languages, and inspired countless documentaries, websites, and follow-up theories. The History Channel's Ancient Aliens series, which premiered in 2009 and has run for nearly 20 seasons, popularized ancient astronaut theories to a massive audience, making phrases like the Anunnaki and ancient alien theorists suggest household references. This cultural phenomenon has shaped how millions of people understand ancient history, archaeology, and humanity's place in the cosmos. Some scholars worry that this represents a dangerous erosion of scientific literacy and historical understanding, that people are accepting pseudo-scientific explanations without learning to critically evaluate evidence or understand how academic disciplines actually work. When someone believes that aliens built the pyramids, they're not just wrong about the pyramids, they're demonstrating a failure to understand evidence, probability, and the scientific method. This failure can extend to other domains, making people vulnerable to misinformation about medicine, climate change, politics, or any other field where expertise and evidence matter. If ancient astronauts can be true despite scholarly consensus opposing them, why not vaccines causing autism, or climate change being a hoax, or the Earth being flat? On the other hand, some argue that alternative theories like the Anunnaki narrative serve a valuable function, encouraging curiosity about ancient civilizations, getting people interested in archaeology and history who might otherwise ignore these subjects, and questioning authority in ways that, even if misguided in this instance, represent healthy skepticism toward institutional power. After all, mainstream science has been wrong before. Continental drift was rejected for decades. Ulcers were thought to be caused by stress until bacteria were discovered to be the culprit, and numerous scientific consensuses have been overturned by new evidence. Maybe, proponents argue, the scholars are wrong about this too. The key difference is that scientific consensuses change based on new evidence, not just alternative interpretation of existing evidence. Continental drift became accepted when seafloor spreading was discovered, when magnetic striping in oceanic crust confirmed the theory, when GPS measurements showed continents actually moving. The bacterial theory of ulcers was proven through controlled experiments, microscopy, and eventually by a researcher infecting himself with the bacteria and developing ulcers. These weren't just new readings of old texts, they were new observations, replicable experiments, and mechanisms that explained how and why the phenomena occurred. The Anunnaki theory, in contrast, hasn't produced new evidence that independently confirms its claims. It's entirely dependent on reinterpreting existing texts and seeing patterns in ambiguous data, like the face on Mars. When new evidence appears, like high-resolution images of Cydonia, it tends to contradict rather than support the theory. When human genetics are mapped, they show evolution, not genetic engineering. When ancient mines are excavated, they date to thousands, not hundreds of thousands of years ago. The theory survives by becoming vaguer and more unfalsifiable, by adding layers of speculation that push the claims beyond what current evidence can test. This is the opposite of how science progresses. Science makes specific, testable predictions that could be proven wrong. If the Anunnaki theory predicted specific genetic markers, archaeological sites, or astronomical phenomena that were then discovered exactly as predicted, it would gain credibility. Instead, it makes claims about things that are either already known and reinterpreted, or things that are conveniently untestable, like bases that vanished without trace, or texts that only reveal their true meaning through unconventional translation methods. There's also a troubling element of cultural appropriation and Western-centric bias in many ancient astronaut theories, including the Anunnaki narrative. Notice how the theories almost always focus on non-Western civilizations, the Sumerians, Egyptians, Maya, Inca, Easter Islanders. The implicit assumption is that these brown-skinned people couldn't possibly have achieved their architectural and astronomical accomplishments without help from advanced visitors. Meanwhile, Greek philosophy, Roman engineering, medieval European cathedrals, these are accepted as human achievements without requiring alien explanation. The racism is subtle but present. The assumption that some civilizations needed help while others were naturally brilliant. Indigenous peoples and descendant communities often object strenuously to ancient astronaut theories about their ancestors. Modern Maya scholars and cultural representatives have repeatedly stated that their ancestors built the pyramids and developed the calendar systems through human ingenuity, knowledge transmission, and generations of effort. They find it insulting when outsiders suggest they needed alien assistance. The same applies to Egyptians, Mesopotamian descendant communities, and others whose heritage is co-opted into narratives that diminish their ancestors' achievements while exoticizing their cultures. Furthermore, the focus on monuments and astronomy overlooks the full richness of these civilizations. The Sumerians didn't just observe planets. They invented writing, developed law codes, created literature, built complex irrigation systems, and established social structures that influenced civilization for millennia. Reducing them to receivers of alien knowledge ignores their actual accomplishments and the cultural contexts that made those accomplishments possible. It treats them as primitives who stumbled upon or were given advanced knowledge, rather than as intelligent people solving problems creatively with the resources and understanding available to them. Let's also examine what the Sumerian texts actually tell us about their world view, religion, and cosmology when we read them on their own terms, rather than through the lens of ancient astronaut theory. The Sumerians saw the cosmos as ordered by divine will, with gods controlling every aspect of existence from the fertility of crops to the flooding of rivers to the movements of celestial bodies. This wasn't primitive superstition, it was a sophisticated attempt to understand causation and agency in the world. When the Euphrates flooded, destroying crops and drowning livestock, the Sumerians understood this as a divine action, punishment or warning or simple divine whim. They developed rituals, prayers, and sacrifices to influence these divine powers, to seek favor and avert disaster. The creation myths, like the Enuma Elish and the Sumerian creation accounts, explained how the world came to be ordered, how land separated from sea, how the sky was lifted above the earth, how humans were created to serve the gods. These explanations weren't scientific in our sense, but they were rational within their framework. They established cosmic order, justified human social structures like kingship and temple priesthood, and provided meaning to existence. Humans served the gods through offerings and proper worship, and in return the gods maintained cosmic order and provided blessings. This is the social contract of Mesopotamian religion. The gods themselves were organized hierarchically, mirroring human social structures. Anu was the supreme sky god, but he was distant, not directly involved in daily human affairs. Enlil was the chief god of the pantheon during the Sumerian period, the lord of air and storms, who decreed fates and whose word determined the course of events. Enki was the god of wisdom, fresh water, and crafts, the clever deity who often helped humanity through his cunning and knowledge. Inanna or Ishtar was the goddess of love and war, fierce and passionate, whose myths explore themes of power, sexuality, and divine authority. These gods had personalities, relationships, conflicts, and stories. They weren't abstract forces or alien administrators following protocol. They were characters in a living mythology that explained the world and provided frameworks for ritual and ethics. When Inanna descends to the underworld and is killed by her sister Ereshkigal, only to be resurrected through Enki's intervention, the myth isn't describing space travel or alien politics. It's exploring themes of death, renewal, sacrifice, and the changing seasons. It had ritual significance. It was recited in ceremonies. It connected to agricultural cycles and cultural practices. Reading these myths as literal accounts of alien activities strips them of their actual meaning and reduces them to bad science fiction. The richness of Mesopotamian literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh with its meditation on mortality and friendship, the Descent of Inanna with its powerful imagery of death and rebirth, the Atrahasis epic with its flood narrative that influenced the biblical story of Noah, all of this becomes mere misunderstood description of ancient technology. It's reductionist in the extreme, taking profound cultural artifacts and flattening them into transparent allegories for spacecraft and genetic laboratories. Moreover, we have extensive documentation of how Mesopotamian religion actually functioned in society. Temple complexes were economic centers, storing grain, managing land, employing artisans and laborers. Priests performed daily rituals, feeding the god statues, clothing them, bringing them offerings. Kings claimed divine authority, presenting themselves as chosen by the gods to rule. Religious festivals mark the calendar, bringing communities together for shared worship and celebration. This is documented in administrative texts, in royal inscriptions, in temple archives that record every sheep sacrificed and every grain measurement offered. The gods weren't absent alien overlords. They were active presences in daily religious and social life, or at least that's how the culture understood and represented them. The astronomical knowledge of the Mesopotamians, which Sitchin pointed to as evidence of alien teaching, was actually developed through methodical observation over centuries. Babylonian astronomers kept detailed records of celestial phenomena, tracking the positions of planets, noting eclipses, recording unusual events. Over generations they noticed patterns. They could predict when planets would appear in certain constellations, when eclipses were likely, when the moon would be full. This knowledge was used for astrology, the belief that celestial events influenced earthly affairs, and for creating calendars that regulated agricultural and religious activities. The mathematics required for these calculations was sophisticated, using sexagesimal base 60 number systems that allowed for complex astronomical and architectural calculations. But this sophistication arose from practical needs and careful observation, not alien intervention. The Babylonians made errors too. They didn't know the true nature of planets as other worlds. They thought celestial bodies were divine or controlled by divine beings. They couldn't explain the physical mechanisms behind planetary motion. Their astronomy was impressive, but also limited by their technology and conceptual framework. It's exactly what we'd expect from intelligent people carefully observing the sky over many generations. When we find clay tablets with astronomical tables, planetary positions, and eclipse predictions, we're not seeing ancient humanity recording lessons from extraterrestrial teachers. We're seeing the product of human curiosity, pattern recognition, and the gradual accumulation of knowledge through cultural transmission. The Babylonians taught their astronomical knowledge to the Greeks, who refined it further, who passed it to Islamic astronomers during the medieval period, who eventually influenced European astronomy, leading to Copernicus, Galileo. These weren't just new readings of old texts, they were new observations, replicable experiments, and mechanisms that explained how and why the phenomena occurred. The Anunnaki theory, in contrast, hasn't produced new evidence that independently confirms its claims. It's entirely dependent on reinterpreting existing texts and seeing patterns in ambiguous data, like the face on Mars. When new evidence appears, like high-resolution images of Cydonia, it tends to contradict rather than support the theory. When human genetics are mapped, they show evolution, not genetic engineering. When ancient mines are excavated, they date to thousands, not hundreds of thousands of years ago. The theory survives by becoming vaguer and more unfalsifiable, by adding layers of speculation that push the claims beyond what current evidence can test. This is the opposite of how science progresses. Science makes specific, testable predictions that could be proven wrong. If the Anunnaki theory predicted specific genetic markers, archaeological sites, or astronomical phenomena that were then discovered exactly as predicted, it would gain credibility. Instead, it makes claims about things that are either already known and reinterpreted, or things that are conveniently untestable, like bases that vanished without trace, or texts that only reveal their true meaning through unconventional translation methods. There's also a troubling element of cultural appropriation and Western-centric bias in many ancient astronaut theories, including the Anunnaki narrative. Notice how the theories almost always focus on non-Western civilizations, the Sumerians, Egyptians, Maya, Inca, Easter Islanders. The implicit assumption is that these brown-skinned people couldn't possibly have achieved their architectural and astronomical accomplishments without help from advanced visitors. Meanwhile, Greek philosophy, Roman engineering, medieval European cathedrals, these are accepted as human achievements without requiring alien explanation. The racism is subtle but present. The assumption that some civilizations needed help while others were naturally brilliant. Indigenous peoples and descendant communities often object strenuously to ancient astronaut theories about their ancestors. Modern Maya scholars and cultural representatives have repeatedly stated that their ancestors built the pyramids and developed the calendar systems through human ingenuity, knowledge transmission, and generations of effort. They find it insulting when outsiders suggest they needed alien assistance. The same applies to Egyptians, Mesopotamian descendant communities, and others whose heritage is co-opted into narratives that diminish their ancestors' achievements while exoticizing their cultures. Furthermore, the focus on monuments and astronomy overlooks the full richness of these civilizations. The Sumerians didn't just observe planets. They invented writing, developed law codes, created literature, built complex irrigation systems, and established social structures that influenced civilization for millennia. Reducing them to receivers of alien knowledge ignores their actual accomplishments and the cultural contexts that made those accomplishments possible. It treats them as primitives who stumbled upon or were given advanced knowledge, rather than as intelligent people solving problems creatively with the resources and understanding available to them. Let's also examine what the Sumerian texts actually tell us about their world view, religion, and cosmology when we read them on their own terms, rather than through the lens of ancient astronaut theory. The Sumerians saw the cosmos as ordered by divine will, with gods controlling every aspect of existence from the fertility of crops to the flooding of rivers to the movements of celestial bodies. This wasn't primitive superstition, it was a sophisticated attempt to understand causation and agency in the world. When the Euphrates flooded, destroying crops and drowning livestock, the Sumerians understood this as a divine action, punishment or warning or simple divine whim. They developed rituals, prayers, and sacrifices to influence these divine powers, to seek favor and avert disaster. The creation myths, like the Enuma Elish and the Sumerian creation accounts, explained how the world came to be ordered, how land separated from sea, how the sky was lifted above the earth, how humans were created to serve the gods. These explanations weren't scientific in our sense, but they were rational within their framework. They established cosmic order, justified human social structures like kingship and temple priesthood, and provided meaning to existence. Humans served the gods through offerings and proper worship, and in return the gods maintained cosmic order and provided blessings. This is the social contract of Mesopotamian religion. The gods themselves were organized hierarchically, mirroring human social structures. Anu was the supreme sky god, but he was distant, not directly involved in daily human affairs. Enlil was the chief god of the pantheon during the Sumerian period, the lord of air and storms, who decreed fates and whose word determined the course of events. Enki was the god of wisdom, fresh water, and crafts, the clever deity who often helped humanity through his cunning and knowledge. Inanna or Ishtar was the goddess of love and war, fierce and passionate, whose myths explore themes of power, sexuality, and divine authority. These gods had personalities, relationships, conflicts, and stories. They weren't abstract forces or alien administrators following protocol. They were characters in a living mythology that explained the world and provided frameworks for ritual and ethics. When Inanna descends to the underworld and is killed by her sister Ereshkigal, only to be resurrected through Enki's intervention, the myth isn't describing space travel or alien politics, It's exploring themes of death, renewal, sacrifice, and the changing seasons. It had ritual significance. It was recited in ceremonies. It connected to agricultural cycles and cultural practices. Reading these myths as literal accounts of alien activities strips them of their actual meaning and reduces them to bad science fiction. The richness of Mesopotamian literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh with its meditation on mortality and friendship, the Descent of Inanna with its powerful imagery of death and rebirth, the Atrahasis epic with its flood narrative that influenced the biblical story of Noah, all of this becomes mere misunderstood description of ancient technology. It's reductionist in the extreme, taking profound cultural artifacts and flattening them into transparent allegories for spacecraft and genetic laboratories. Moreover, we have extensive documentation of how Mesopotamian religion actually functioned in society. Temple complexes were economic centers, storing grain, managing land, employing artisans and laborers. Priests performed daily rituals, feeding the god statues, clothing them, bringing them offerings. Kings claimed divine authority, presenting themselves as chosen by the gods to rule. Religious festivals mark the calendar, bringing communities together for shared worship and celebration. This is documented in administrative texts, in royal inscriptions, in temple archives that record every sheep sacrificed and every grain measurement offered. The gods weren't absent alien overlords. They were active presences in daily religious and social life, or at least that's how the culture understood and represented them. The astronomical knowledge of the Mesopotamians, which Sitchin pointed to as evidence of alien teaching, was actually developed through methodical observation over centuries. Babylonian astronomers kept detailed records of celestial phenomena, tracking the positions of planets, noting eclipses, recording unusual events. Over generations they noticed patterns. They could predict when planets would appear in certain constellations, when eclipses were likely, when the moon would be full. This knowledge was used for astrology, the belief that celestial events influenced earthly affairs, and for creating calendars that regulated agricultural and religious activities. The mathematics required for these calculations was sophisticated, using sexagesimal base 60 number systems that allowed for complex astronomical and architectural calculations. But this sophistication arose from practical needs and careful observation, not alien intervention. The Babylonians made errors too. They didn't know the true nature of planets as other worlds. They thought celestial bodies were divine or controlled by divine beings. They couldn't explain the physical mechanisms behind planetary motion. Their astronomy was impressive but also limited by their technology and conceptual framework. It's exactly what we'd expect from intelligent people carefully observing the sky over many generations. When we find clay tablets with astronomical tables, planetary positions, and eclipse predictions, we're not seeing ancient humanity recording lessons from extraterrestrial teachers. We're seeing the product of human curiosity, pattern recognition, and the gradual accumulation of knowledge through cultural transmission. The Babylonians taught their astronomical knowledge to the Greeks, who refined it further, who passed it to Islamic astronomers during the medieval period, who eventually influenced European astronomy, leading to Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, and Newton. This is how knowledge actually develops, through incremental advances, cultural exchange, occasional leaps of insight, and the building of new understanding on foundations laid by previous generations. So where does this leave us with the question posed at the beginning? Do Sumerian texts reveal evidence of Anunnaki bases on Mars? The answer, if we're being honest with the evidence, is no. The texts don't describe Mars bases, they describe gods in mythological narratives. The astronomical knowledge of the Sumerians, while impressive, doesn't exceed what human observation and calculation could achieve. The archaeological evidence doesn't support ancient genetic engineering or alien visitation. The structures on Mars that supposedly show artificiality are natural geological formations. the interpretations offered by Sitchin and ancient astronaut theorists require accepting translations that professional Assyriologists reject, ignoring contrary evidence, and adding layers of speculation that aren't supported by the primary sources. But acknowledging this doesn't mean the questions themselves are worthless. Asking how ancient civilizations achieved their accomplishments is valuable. It drives archaeological research and historical investigation. Wondering about extraterrestrial life is legitimate. It motivates the search for biosignatures on Mars, exoplanet studies, and SETI research. Questioning mainstream interpretations can be healthy when done with intellectual honesty and openness to evidence. The problem comes when we commit to conclusions before properly examining the evidence, when we decide the answer must be aliens and then work backward to make the evidence fit. Critical thinking requires that we proportion our beliefs to the evidence. Extraordinary claims, like ancient alien visitors, require extraordinary evidence, not just alternative readings of ambiguous texts. When mainstream scholars who dedicate their careers to studying Sumerian language and culture say that the texts describe mythological gods, not extraterrestrials, we should take that seriously unless we have compelling reasons to think they are all wrong or deceiving us. Conspiracy theories that require vast numbers of experts to be either incompetent or complicit in suppression are inherently implausible. Expertise exists for a reason, and scholarly consensus emerges from evidence and argument, not from groupthink or conspiracy. At the same time, we should maintain intellectual humility about what we don't know. There are mysteries in ancient history that remain unsolved. There are questions about human origins that genetics and paleontology are still working to answer, and there are possibilities about life in the universe that we haven't yet explored. Being skeptical of the Anunnaki Mars base theory doesn't mean being closed-minded to all alternative ideas. It means applying consistent standards of evidence and logic to evaluate claims. The appeal of the Anunnaki narrative tells us something important about human psychology and culture. We're drawn to stories that give us cosmic significance, that connect us to something larger than ourselves, that suggest hidden knowledge waiting to be discovered. We're suspicious of authority and expertise, sometimes for good reason given historical examples of scientific error and institutional cover-ups. We're pattern-seeking creatures who see meaning in coincidence and design in randomness. All of these traits served our ancestors well in evolutionary terms, but they can lead us astray when we're evaluating complex historical and scientific questions. Understanding these psychological tendencies helps us become better critical thinkers. When we feel strongly drawn to a theory, we should ask why. What emotional or psychological needs does it fulfill? When we're quick to dismiss expert consensus, we should ask whether we're being properly skeptical or just confirming our biases. When we see patterns that others miss, we should consider whether we've discovered something real or whether we're experiencing pareidolia and apophenia, seeing meaningful patterns in random data. The legacy of Sitchin's work and the broader ancient astronaut movement is complex. On one hand, its popularized interest in ancient civilizations gotten people excited about archaeology and history and raised questions that, even if answered differently than Sitchin proposed, are worth asking. On the other hand, it spread misinformation, undermined trust in scholarly expertise, and promoted interpretations of ancient cultures that indigenous peoples and descendant communities often find offensive. It's created a parallel universe of alternative archaeology where evidence is evaluated by different standards and where conspiracy and suppression explain away every contradiction. For those who find the Anunnaki theory compelling, the path forward should involve deeper engagement with primary sources, learning ancient languages or at least reading multiple scholarly translations, studying archaeology and genetics to understand how evidence is actually evaluated, and being willing to change conclusions if the evidence doesn't support them. For those who reject the theory, the path forward should involve understanding why so many people find it appealing, addressing the legitimate questions it raises even while disagreeing with the answers, and communicating scientific and historical knowledge in ways that are accessible and engaging rather than dismissive or condescending. The question of whether we're alone in the universe remains open, and it's one that science is actively investigating through multiple approaches. We've sent rovers to Mars to look for signs of past or present life. We're analyzing the atmospheres of exoplanets for biosignatures, chemical markers that might indicate biological processes. We're listening for radio signals from technological civilizations. We're studying extremophiles on Earth, organisms that survive in conditions we once thought impossible for life, to understand the range of environments where biology might exist. If we do find evidence of extraterrestrial life, whether microbial life on Mars or an intelligent signal from the stars, it will be discovered through the scientific method, through instruments and observations that can be independently verified, through evidence that withstands rigorous scrutiny. It won't come from reinterpreted ancient texts or ambiguous rock formations. And when that discovery happens, if it happens, it will be momentous precisely because it will be real, confirmable, and honest, not dependent on faith or selective reading of evidence. The Sumerian texts are treasures of human cultural heritage, documents that preserve the thoughts, beliefs, and knowledge of one of humanity's first civilizations. They deserve to be read with respect for what they actually are, products of their time and culture, expressions of how ancient people understood their world. Mining them for alien secrets disrespects both the texts and the people who created them. It treats Mesopotamian religion as primitive and confused, rather than as a sophisticated worldview that made sense within its own framework. It assumes that ancient people couldn't describe their own experiences accurately, that they needed modern interpreters to tell them what they really meant. When we read the Enuma Elish as Cretan mythology, we can appreciate its literary qualities, its theological sophistication, its political context, its influence on later traditions. When we reduce it to a garbled account of planetary collisions, we lose all of that richness. When we understand the Anunnaki as gods in a pantheon, we can study how Mesopotamian religion evolved, how different cities emphasized different deities, how theological concepts developed over time. When we decide they were aliens, we foreclose all of that complexity in favor of a simple, anachronistic explanation. So as we come to the end of this exploration, what can we conclude about the claim that Sumerian texts reveal evidence of Anunnaki bases on Mars? We can conclude that the claim is not supported by evidence when evaluated according to scholarly standards. The texts don't describe what Sitchin claimed they described. The translations he offered are rejected by experts in Sumerian and Akkadian. The astronomical knowledge of the Mesopotamians is impressive but explainable through human observation and calculation, and the structures on Mars are natural geological features, not artificial constructions. The theory requires accepting multiple extraordinary premises without extraordinary evidence to support them. But we can also conclude that the questions raised by the theory about human origins, ancient knowledge, and extraterrestrial life are worthy of serious investigation through proper scientific methods. We can appreciate the human impulse toward cosmic wonder, the desire to believe we're part of something larger, while still insisting on evidence and reason when evaluating specific claims. We can respect ancient civilizations for what they actually achieved, which is extraordinary enough without needing to invoke alien assistance. The ancient Sumerians built cities, invented writing, developed law codes, created literature, observed the heavens, and established patterns of civilization that influenced human society for thousands of years. They did this through human intelligence, creativity, and perseverance. That's the real wonder. Not alien intervention, but human potential expressed through culture and knowledge across generations. The gods they worshipped, the myths they told, the rituals they performed, These reflect their attempt to understand and influence a world they experienced as alive with divine presence. It's a worldview different from modern scientific materialism, but it's not inferior or confused. It's simply different, appropriate to its time and culture. If there are aliens out there, and statistics suggest there probably are given the vastness of the universe and the commonality of planets, we should want to discover them through honest investigation, not through reinterpreting ancient texts to find what we wish to see. If there are mysteries in human origins that current science hasn't fully explained, we should investigate them through genetics, paleontology, archaeology, and other rigorous disciplines, not through speculation dressed up as ancient wisdom. If ancient civilizations achieved things that seem impossible, we should work harder to understand their actual methods, rather than defaulting to alien intervention. The Anunnaki Mars base theory, for all its popularity and cultural impact, ultimately represents a failure of imagination, not an expansion of it. It suggests that human achievement requires external explanation, that our ancestors couldn't have been as clever as they obviously were, that the monuments and knowledge they left behind must have come from somewhere else. The reality is far more inspiring. We did it ourselves. We've always done it ourselves. Through collaboration, innovation, transmission of knowledge, and the occasional brilliant leap of understanding that pushes civilization forward. As we look to the future, as we send missions to Mars ourselves, as we develop the technology to search for life beyond Earth, as we decode more ancient texts and make new archaeological discoveries, we should do so with both wonder and rigor, open to possibilities but demanding of evidence, curious about mysteries but honest about what we know and what we don't. The cosmos is vast and strange enough without needing to invent false connections to ancient gods who were never astronauts in the first place. The story of the Anunnaki reminds us that mythology matters, not because it's literally true, but because it reveals human hopes, fears, values, and attempts to make sense of existence. When the Sumerians wrote about gods descending from heaven, they were expressing theological concepts about divine transcendence and immanence, about the relationship between cosmic order and earthly chaos, about the proper relationship between humanity and the divine. These are profound questions that every culture addresses through its mythology and religion. Reducing them to confused accounts of spacecraft landings trivializes the actual depth of ancient thought. In the end, the most valuable lesson from examining the Anunnaki Mars base theory might be about how we evaluate claims and evidence in general. In an age of information overload, where anyone can publish theories and where social media algorithms amplify engagement regardless of accuracy, critical thinking becomes essential. We need to learn to ask, where does this information come from? What evidence supports it? What do experts in the relevant fields say? What would prove this wrong? And am I believing this because it's true, or because I want it to be true? These questions apply far beyond ancient astronaut theories. They're relevant to political claims, health information, economic predictions, and every other domain where we need to distinguish between what's real and what's appealing but false. The Anunnaki theory is a case study in motivated reasoning, in how we can construct elaborate narratives by selecting and reinterpreting evidence to fit a predetermined conclusion. Learning to recognize this pattern helps us avoid it in other contexts, makes us more resistant to misinformation and manipulation, and better able to navigate a world where truth and fiction are often deliberately mixed. Before we close, it's worth considering what a genuine discovery of ancient alien contact would actually look like. It wouldn't be ambiguous, it wouldn't require creative reinterpretation of texts, and it wouldn't depend on seeing faces in rocks on Mars. It would be definitive, an artifact made of materials not found on Earth, a structure that demonstrably required technology beyond ancient human capability, a genetic signature that couldn't have evolved naturally, a text in a language that corresponded to no known human language family, something that couldn't be explained away, something that every expert who examined it would have to acknowledge as extraordinary. We don't have anything like that from ancient Sumer or from Mars or from anywhere else. What we have are monuments that humans built, texts that humans wrote, and a red planet shaped by geological forces over billions of years. It's less exciting than alien bases, perhaps, but it's real, and reality has its own wonder when we look at it honestly. The fact that humans developed civilization without alien help makes our achievements more impressive, not less. The fact that the Sumerians invented writing makes their literature more valuable, not less. The fact that Mars evolved through natural processes makes its geology more fascinating, not less. As we wrap up this journey through Sumerian tablets, ancient gods, and speculative theories about Mars, remember that the universe is strange and vast enough to inspire wonder without needing to invent mysteries where none exist. Real archaeology is discovering how ancient people actually lived, what they believed, how they built their civilizations. Real astronomy is understanding how planets and stars actually form and evolve. Real astrobiology is searching for life using instruments and methods that can distinguish between what we hope to find and what's actually there. The Anunnaki were gods in the mythology of ancient Mesopotamia, powerful beings who shaped the cosmos and decreed human destiny in the stories told by Sumerian priests and recorded on clay tablets 5,000 years ago. They weren't aliens from Nibiru, they weren't genetic engineers, and they didn't maintain bases on Mars. They were humanity's attempt to understand divine power and cosmic order through the language and concepts available to Bronze Age civilization, understanding them as what they actually were, rather than what modern speculation wants them to be, honors both the ancient Sumerians who created these myths and the reality of human cultural and intellectual development. The search for extraterrestrial life continues through legitimate scientific channels, and perhaps someday we'll find evidence of life beyond Earth, on Mars or Europa or in a distant star system. When that happens, it will be one of the most profound discoveries in human history, genuinely revolutionary in its implications for biology, philosophy, and our understanding of our place in the cosmos. But it won't validate the Anunnaki theory, because that theory isn't actually about aliens. It's about how we interpret ancient texts, how we evaluate evidence, and what we're willing to believe without sufficient proof. So the next time you encounter a claim about ancient aliens, about hidden knowledge in old texts, about structures on other worlds that seem too perfect to be natural, pause and ask the critical questions. What's the actual evidence? What do experts say? What would convince me this is wrong? Am I being intellectually honest, or am I just enjoying a good story? There's nothing wrong with enjoying speculative theories as entertainment, as thought experiments, as explorations of possibility. The problem comes when we forget the difference between speculation and fact, when we treat conjecture as conclusion, when we build worldviews on foundations that can't support the weight. The cosmos holds genuine mysteries waiting to be solved. Ancient history contains real puzzles that archaeology continues to investigate, and the question of whether we're alone in the universe remains profoundly open. Let's approach these mysteries with the wonder they deserve, but also with the intellectual honesty that truth requires. Let's celebrate ancient human achievement for what it actually was. Let's search for alien life where evidence might actually lead us. And let's read ancient texts for what they can teach us about human culture, belief, and creativity rather than mining them for secrets they don't contain. The Sumerians wrote about gods because they believed in gods, because their entire worldview was organized around divine power and cosmic order, because explaining natural phenomena through divine action made sense within their understanding of causation and agency. When we respect that, when we read their texts as products of their time and culture, we learn something genuine about human history, about how civilizations develop, about how people make meaning in the world. When we impose modern concepts like genetic engineering and space travel onto their myths, we learn nothing except that we're willing to distort the past to make it conform to our present obsessions. So let the Anunnaki rest in their proper place, not on Mars but in the mythology of ancient Mesopotamia, alongside all the other gods that humans have worshipped, feared and loved throughout history. Let Mars be what it actually is, a cold, dry, fascinating world shaped by natural forces, waiting for human explorers to arrive and study it properly. And let ancient texts be what they are, windows into past cultures, records of human thought and belief, treasures of cultural heritage that deserve to be read with respect and understanding, rather than mined for modern agendas. As we close this exploration, I want to thank you for joining me on this journey through ancient Sumer, through the development of alternative archaeology theories, and through the critical examination of extraordinary claims. Whether you came here believing in the Anunnaki theory or skeptical of it, I hope this discussion has given you tools for thinking about how we evaluate historical and scientific claims, how we distinguish between evidence and interpretation, and how we balance wonder with reason. The universe is full of genuine mysteries that don't require us to abandon critical thinking. Ancient civilizations achieved remarkable things that we're still working to fully understand. The possibility of life beyond Earth remains one of the most profound questions we can ask. These are worthy of our curiosity, our investigation, and our honest engagement with evidence. We don't need to invent alien visitors to make ancient history interesting. We just need to look at what actually happened with clear eyes and open minds. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more deep dives into historical mysteries, ancient civilizations, and the intersection of archaeology and alternative theories, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support makes it possible to continue creating these long-form explorations of fascinating topics. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts, whether you agree or disagree with the conclusions here. Thoughtful discussion is how we all learn and grow in understanding. Before we truly conclude, let's dive deeper into the specific Sumerian texts that are most commonly cited in support of the Anunnaki theory, examining what they actually say versus how they've been reinterpreted. This detailed analysis will help us understand not just what the theory claims, but how interpretation and translation shape our understanding of ancient documents. The Atrahasis epic, dating to around 1700 BCE but based on earlier Sumerian traditions, is one of the most frequently cited texts. It tells the story of creation and the flood, beginning with a time when only the gods existed and when junior gods, the Igigi, performed all the labor. According to the standard translation, these junior gods grew weary of their toil, digging irrigation canals and maintaining the rivers and fields of the earth for the senior gods, particularly Enlil, the chief deity. After 40 years of this back-breaking labor, the Igigi rebelled, burning their tools and marching on Enlil's residence to demand better treatment. The gods convened to discuss the crisis, and Enki, the wise god of water and crafts, proposed a solution: create humans to take over the work. He instructed the birth goddess Nintu, also called Mami, to fashion humanity from clay mixed with the blood of a slain god, Weilu, one of the rebel leaders who was sacrificed for this purpose. The text describes the creation process in detail. 7 males and 7 females were created initially, formed from clay and divine blood, animated by the goddess, and set to work serving the gods. Humanity multiplied, spread across the earth, and took over the labor that had previously exhausted the Igigi. The gods were pleased and settled into leisure, enjoying the benefits of human service through offerings and worship. This is a creation myth explaining human origins and the purpose of humanity within the divine cosmic order. It establishes why humans exist, to serve the gods, and why worship and offerings matter, because they fulfill the function for which humanity was created. Sitchin read this story completely differently. In his interpretation, the Igigi weren't junior gods but rather Anunnaki workers stationed on Mars or in Earth orbit, while the senior gods like Enlil and Enki were commanders of the Earth mission. the labor they performed wasn't mythological maintenance of cosmic order, but actual mining of gold in Africa. The rebellion wasn't a theological crisis, but a labor dispute among extraterrestrial workers. The creation of humans wasn't a mythological event, but genetic engineering, taking Homo erectus DNA and splicing in Anunnaki genes to create Homo sapiens as a hybrid species capable of the physical labor the Anunnaki wanted to avoid. The sacrifice of Wai'ilu became, in Sitchin's reading, the source of genetic material, his blood representing his DNA. The process of mixing clay with divine blood became a metaphor for genetic engineering, combining terrestrial hominid material with extraterrestrial genetic code. The 7 males and 7 females became the first genetically engineered humans, prototypes that would then reproduce naturally to create the human population. Every element of the myth was reinterpreted through the lens of modern science, transformed from theological narrative into poorly understood scientific reportage. But this reading requires ignoring what the text actually emphasizes. The Atrahasis spends considerable time on theological concepts like the nature of divinity, the relationship between gods and humans, and the importance of proper worship and offerings. It describes the gods as having emotions, desires, conflicts, and social dynamics that mirror human society. They eat, drink, sleep, argue, make decisions through councils, and respond to circumstances in ways that are thoroughly anthropomorphic. These aren't the characteristics of advanced extraterrestrials following a mining protocol. They're the characteristics of deities in ancient Near Eastern mythology. Moreover, the creation account in Atrahasis uses language that's clearly metaphorical and ritual. The goddess Nintu performs incantations while creating humans. She uses magical number symbolism. She operates in a sacred space called the House of Fate. The text describes her wisdom and magical power, not her scientific knowledge or technological capability. When humans are created, they're described as receiving the breath of life, the image of the gods, and the capacity for understanding, all theological concepts that appear throughout ancient Near Eastern religious texts. There's no mention of laboratories, genetic material in a modern sense, or anything resembling scientific procedures as we understand them. The flood narrative that follows in the Atrahasis also contradicts a literal technological reading. The gods decide to destroy humanity because humans have become too numerous and too noisy, disturbing the gods' rest. This is hardly a rational response from advanced beings with spacecraft and technology. They could simply leave Earth or establish soundproof quarters or reduce the human population through contraception or disease. Instead, they send a flood, a natural disaster, which the text describes in mythological terms as the gods opening the dams of heaven and breaking the bolts that hold back the cosmic waters. Enki, characterized throughout the epic as humanity's friend and protector, warns the pious man Atrahasis about the coming flood and instructs him to build a boat to save himself, his family, and animals. The dimensions of the boat, the materials used, the loading of animals, the duration of the flood, the landing on a mountain, the sending out of birds to test if the waters had receded. All of these details parallel the biblical flood narrative in Genesis, because the Genesis account drew on these earlier Mesopotamian traditions. This is comparative mythology, the study of how myths develop, change, and influence each other across cultures and time periods. It's not garbled history of an actual global flood caused by extraterrestrial intervention. Geological evidence confirms there was never a global flood covering all mountains within human history. There have been significant local floods, including catastrophic flooding of the Black Sea region around 5600 BCE, when rising Mediterranean waters breached a natural dam, an event that may have influenced flood mythology in the Near East. But a literal worldwide flood that destroyed all life except what survived on a single boat is physically impossible given what we know about water volumes, atmospheric physics, and the fossil record. Species exist on different continents with no explanation for how they got back to their native ranges after supposedly all being released from a single boat on Mount Ararat or whatever mountain the myth specifies. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic we touched on earlier, deserves deeper analysis because Sitchin used it extensively to support his planetary collision theory. The text begins with a cosmogony describing the state before creation. Apsu, representing fresh water, and Tiamat, representing salt water, existed primordially. Their waters mingled, and from this mixing emerged the first gods, Leimu and Lahamu, then Anshar and Kishar, then Anu, then Ea or Enki. Each generation of gods was more powerful than the previous, a pattern common in ancient theogonies explaining the development of cosmic order from primordial chaos. The younger gods became active and noisy, disturbing Apsu's peace. Apsu complained to Tiamat that he couldn't rest because of the younger gods' commotion, and he proposed destroying them. Tiamat initially resisted, arguing that they shouldn't destroy what they had created, but Apsu was determined. However, Ea discovered the plot and used magic to put Apsu into a deep sleep, then killed him and established his dwelling on Apsu's body. This is mythological imagery describing the establishment of divine order, with the wise god Ea triumphing over the primordial waters and making them his domain, the freshwater sources beneath the earth. Ea and his wife Damkina then produced Marduk, who is described as the most perfect of the gods, endowed with extraordinary powers and attributes. Meanwhile, Tiamat, provoked by Apsu's death and encouraged by other gods, decided to take revenge. She created an army of monsters, serpents, dragons, scorpion men, and other fearsome beings, and she appointed the god Kingu as their leader, giving him the Tablet of Destinies, a symbol of ultimate authority. The gods panicked at the threat and sought a champion to fight Tiamat. Ea tried first but failed. Anu tried and also failed. Finally, young Marduk volunteered, but he demanded a price. If he defeated Tiamat, he would become supreme king of the gods, his word would be law, and none of the older gods would challenge his authority. The gods, desperate, agreed to Marduk's terms. They held a feast, got drunk, and formally proclaimed Marduk as their king, giving him the throne, the scepter, and the authority to command all of them. Marduk then armed himself with weapons, lightning, winds, a bow and arrow, a mace, and a net. He rode out in his storm chariot to confront Tiamat. The battle is described dramatically. Marduk challenged Tiamat to single combat. She opened her mouth to swallow him, but Marduk sent the winds into her mouth, inflating her body so she couldn't close her jaws. He then shot an arrow down her throat, piercing her heart and killing her. He captured her army, bound them, and took the Tablet of Destinies from Kingu, claiming ultimate authority. Marduk then performed the act of creation. He split Tiamat's corpse in two halves like a shellfish, as the text says. From one half he made the sky, setting up bars and posting guards to prevent her waters from escaping. From the other half he created the earth. He established the positions of the stars, set up the calendar, created the phases of the moon, and assigned domains to the various gods. Finally, he created humanity from the blood of Kingu, the rebel god, so that humans would serve the gods and free the deities from labor. The gods built Babylon and Marduk's great temple Esagila as a celebration of his kingship, and the epic ends with the recitation of Marduk's 50 names, each describing one of his powers or attributes. This is sophisticated political theology. The text was composed during the Old Babylonian period, around 1800 to 1600 BCE, when Babylon was rising to become the dominant power in Mesopotamia. It takes older Sumerian traditions about gods like Ea and Enlil and reorganizes them with Marduk, Babylon's patron deity, at the center. It justifies Babylonian supremacy by showing how their god became king of all gods through strength, wisdom, and the consent of the divine assembly. It explains the cosmic order, why the sky is above and the earth below, why the stars move in their courses, why seasons change, why humanity exists to serve the gods, its creation mythology serving political and religious purposes, exactly what we see in the mythologies of many ancient civilizations. Sitchin, however, read the Enuma Elish as badly garbled astronomy. Tiamat was a planet between Mars and Jupiter, he claimed, though the text never identifies Tiamat with any location in space or describes her as anything other than a sea monster. Marduk or Nibiru, he claimed they're the same, was a rogue planet on an elliptical orbit that passed through the inner solar system every 3,600 years. During one of these passages, Nibiru or one of its moons collided with Tiamat, splitting the planet in two. One half became Earth, displaced inward to its current orbit. The other half became the asteroid belt, the scattered debris of a destroyed world. Tiamat's moons became Earth's moon and other objects in the solar system. Kingu specifically became Earth's moon, according to Sitchin. This reading requires accepting that ancient Babylonians knew about planetary dynamics, orbital mechanics, and the existence of a planet beyond Saturn, yet described these cosmic events using the language of dragons, mouths, blood, and corpses. It requires believing that they understood that the asteroid belt was the remains of a destroyed planet, an idea that modern astronomy actually rejects since the asteroid belt doesn't contain enough mass to have been a planet, and appears to be primordial material that never coalesced into a planet due to Jupiter's gravitational influence. It requires accepting that a planetary collision would produce one intact planet, Earth, rather than two destroyed planets or a massive debris field. The physics don't work either. If a planet-sized object collided with another planet with enough force to break it apart, the energy released would vaporize both bodies, not split one cleanly in half and leave the other intact to become a functioning world like Earth. Planetary formation and collision dynamics have been extensively studied through computer modeling, observation of other stellar systems, and analysis of our own solar system's history. We understand how planets form from accretion disks, how they migrate through gravitational interactions, how collisions affect their composition and structure. None of this supports Sitchin's scenario drawn from the Enuma Elish. Furthermore, if such a collision had occurred in the relatively recent past, geologically speaking, we would see evidence in Earth's composition, in the distribution of materials in the asteroid belt, in the orbital dynamics of the inner solar system. We would see disruption in the cratering record on the Moon, Mars, and other bodies. We would see isotopic signatures in Earth's rocks indicating when the planet formed and whether it incorporated material from a catastrophic collision. All of this evidence tells us that Earth formed about 4.5 billion years ago through accretion of material in the solar nebula, that it suffered a major collision early in its history with a Mars-sized body called Theia, which created the Moon, and that it's been in its current orbit ever since, slowly cooling, developing oceans, atmosphere, and eventually life. The Theia collision is actually well supported by evidence. It explains why the Moon has a composition similar to Earth's mantle but depleted in iron, why the Moon is unusually large relative to Earth compared to most planet-moon systems, and why Earth and the Moon have similar oxygen isotope ratios. This collision happened about 4.4 billion years ago, shortly after Earth's formation, billions of years before life emerged, let alone before humans appeared. It has nothing to do with the Enuma Elish, which was written in the 2nd millennium BCE to explain Babylonian theology and politics, not to record planetary astronomy from billions of years earlier. Let's examine another key text, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which Sitchin and other ancient astronaut theorists have mined for evidence of ancient technology and extraterrestrial contact. Gilgamesh is the earliest known work of great literature, a Mesopotamian epic about a Sumerian king of Uruk, who may have been a real historical figure around 2700 BCE, though the epic itself was composed much later and combines historical memory with mythology, philosophy, and religious teachings. The story follows Gilgamesh, described as 2/3 god and 1/3 human, which in ancient thinking meant he was semi-divine, born of a goddess mother and human father, possessing superhuman strength and wisdom but still mortal. Gilgamesh ruled Uruk as a tyrant, exhausting his people with constant building projects and asserting his right to sleep with brides on their wedding nights. The people cried out to the gods for relief, and the gods created Enkidu, a wild man who lived with animals in the wilderness, as a rival to distract Gilgamesh. After Enkidu was civilized through encounter with a temple prostitute, learning to eat bread, drink beer, wear clothes, and join human society, he traveled to Uruk and fought Gilgamesh. The two mighty warriors battled to a standstill, neither able to defeat the other, and from this mutual respect they became close friends, brothers in all but blood. Together Gilgamesh and Enkidu embarked on adventures. They journeyed to the cedar forest to slay Humbaba, the monster guardian appointed by the god Enlil to protect the sacred trees. This adventure can be read as a tale about environmental destruction and the hubris of civilization, as Gilgamesh and Enkidu cut down the mighty cedars to bring timber back to Uruk for building projects, killing the forest protector in the process. After their return, the goddess Ishtar proposed marriage to Gilgamesh, but he rejected her harshly, reciting a long list of her previous lovers whom she'd treated badly, turning them into animals or abandoning them. Insulted and furious, Ishtar demanded that her father Anu send the Bull of Heaven to punish Gilgamesh. The Bull of Heaven descended to Uruk, a creature so powerful that each snort of its nostrils opened chasms that swallowed hundreds of men. But Gilgamesh and Enkidu fought together and killed the bull, with Enkidu grabbing it by the tail while Gilgamesh delivered the killing blow. They tore out the bull's heart and presented it to the sun god Shamash, then displayed the bull's haunches to insult Ishtar. This act of supreme hubris, killing a divine beast and mocking a goddess, brought consequences. The gods held council and decided that one of the two heroes must die for their offences. They chose Enkidu, who fell ill and suffered for 12 days before dying, while Gilgamesh watched helplessly as his beloved friend withered away. Enkidu's death shattered Gilgamesh, confronting him with his own mortality for the first time. Despite being 2/3 divine, he too would eventually die. This realization sent him on a desperate quest to discover the secret of eternal life. He journeyed beyond the known world, traveling through darkness, crossing the waters of death, seeking Utnapishtim, the survivor of the great flood whom the gods had granted immortality. Along the way, Gilgamesh encountered various beings who told him his quest was futile, that death was the fate of all humanity, that he should instead enjoy life while he had it, eating, drinking, celebrating, loving, because that was all humans could do in the face of inevitable mortality. But Gilgamesh persisted until he finally reached Utnapishtim, who lived in a distant land beyond the waters of death. Gilgamesh demanded to know how Utnapishtim gained immortality, and in response Utnapishtim told the story of the flood, how the gods decided to destroy humanity, how Ea secretly warned him to build a boat, how he saved his family and animals, how the flood covered the world, how the boat eventually landed on a mountain, and how the gods, realizing they had destroyed the source of their offerings and service, regretted their decision and granted Utnapishtim eternal life as compensation and apology. Utnapishtim explained that his immortality was a unique gift for a unique circumstance, and that Gilgamesh could not obtain it the same way. However, he offered Gilgamesh a challenge, if Gilgamesh could stay awake for 6 days and 7 nights, proving he could resist sleep, the brother of death. Perhaps he could resist death itself. Gilgamesh agreed, but immediately fell asleep, exhausted from his journey. Utnapishtim's wife baked a loaf of bread each day Gilgamesh slept, stacking them beside him as proof of his failure. When Gilgamesh awoke, he tried to claim he had only dozed for a moment, but the bread loaves, ranging from fresh to mouldy, proved he had slept for days. His quest for immortality had failed. Preparing to depart, Utnapishtim's wife convinced her husband to give Gilgamesh a consolation prize. Utnapishtim revealed the existence of a plant growing at the bottom of the sea that could restore youth, not granting immortality, but allowing rejuvenation. Gilgamesh dove deep into the waters, retrieved the plant, and began his journey home to Uruk, planning to test the plant on an old man in his city before using it himself. But while he bathed in a cool pool during the journey, a serpent smelled the plant's fragrance, emerged from the water, ate the plant, and slithered away after shedding its skin renewed. Gilgamesh wept, realizing he had lost his last chance to escape mortality. He returned to Uruk empty-handed but changed. The epic ends with Gilgamesh describing the great walls of Uruk that he built, suggesting that he had accepted mortal limits and chosen to leave behind architectural and cultural legacy rather than seeking personal immortality. The epic is a profound meditation on mortality, friendship, the limits of power, and what makes life meaningful in the face of inevitable death. It's one of the first great works of existential literature, asking questions that humans still grapple with. What happens when we die? How should we live knowing we will die? What can we create that outlasts our individual existence? Sitchin and other alternative theorists read this epic through a technological lens, identifying various elements as evidence of ancient alien contact. Gilgamesh, being two-thirds divine, became genetic engineering, with alien DNA making up two-thirds of his genome. The superhuman strength and long life attributed to semi-divine figures became results of hybrid genetics, combining long-lived alien physiology with human traits. Enkidu's creation by the gods became another genetic experiment, a separate attempt to create humans with different characteristics. The Cedar Forest adventure became a mission to clear land or access resources in a protected zone, with Humbaba reinterpreted as either an alien guardian or an automated defense system using advanced technology described in mythological terms. The Bull of Heaven became a technological weapon or vehicle, its earth-shattering power described as advanced weaponry that created craters or destruction, its defeat by Gilgamesh and Enkidu demonstrating their access to comparable technology or knowledge. Utnapishtim's immortality became evidence of alien technology that could extend lifespan indefinitely, granted to a favored human who had proven useful during the crisis of the flood. The plant of rejuvenation became a biological substance with age-reversing properties, possibly alien in origin, lost to humanity when the serpent consumed it, with the serpent's skin shedding symbolizing the plant's effect. But these readings strip the epic of its actual meaning and literary artistry. The Epic of Gilgamesh is carefully structured, using repetition, parallel episodes, and symbolic imagery to develop its themes. When Gilgamesh rejects Ishtar, the text lists her previous lovers in a pattern that demonstrates the dangers of divine favor and the costs of intimacy with forces beyond human control. When Enkidu dies, his suffering and Gilgamesh's grief are described in detail that's psychologically sophisticated, showing the stages of denial, anger, and eventual acceptance that characterize human responses to death. The journey to Utnapishtim follows a pattern common to heroic quests, with the protagonist leaving the familiar world, crossing thresholds into the unknown, receiving wisdom from guides, and returning changed even if unsuccessful in the original goal. Reading the epic as a confused account of genetic engineering and advanced technology completely misses the literary and philosophical sophistication of the text. The ancient Mesopotamians were thinking deeply about human nature, about what separated humans from animals and from gods, about how to live well despite the knowledge of mortality, about the relationships between individuals and society, between ambition and acceptance, between power and wisdom. These are the concerns that drive the narrative, not poorly understood descriptions of biotechnology. Moreover, the description of Gilgamesh being two-thirds divine isn't meant to be mathematically precise genetics. It's mythological language indicating his semi-divine status, superior to regular humans but inferior to full gods. Ancient Near Eastern literature frequently described semi-divine heroes using fractional language, sometimes two-thirds divine, sometimes half-divine, sometimes simply the son of a god and a human. This wasn't biological precision, but rather a way of indicating someone's place in the hierarchy of beings that ran from pure humans at the bottom through various grades of semi-divine heroes and spirits up to the great gods at the top. The texts themselves contain internal evidence of their mythological nature rather than historical or scientific accuracy. Gods are described as eating and drinking, getting drunk, having emotions like anger and jealousy and love, needing sleep, being surprised by events, making mistakes in judgment, and changing their minds. These are literary characters with divine attributes, not advanced extraterrestrials following protocols. When Ishtar throws a tantrum because Gilgamesh rejected her, when the gods panic during the flood because they realize they'd destroyed their source of offerings, when Enlil gets angry because Ea violated his decree by warning Utnapishtim about the coming deluge, these are mythological narratives exploring divine personality and divine human relationships, not reports of alien administrators dealing with mission parameters. Let's also examine the so-called Sumerian king list, another document frequently cited in support of ancient astronaut theories. This text, compiled around 2100 BCE but drawing on earlier traditions, lists the kings who ruled various Sumerian cities from the beginning of kingship through the early 2nd millennium BCE. The list is fascinating historically because it attempts to create a unified chronology of rule, presenting kingship as something that moved from city to city throughout Sumerian history, each dynasty rising and falling in sequence. But the list is most famous for its opening section, which claims that before the flood, kings ruled for impossibly long periods, tens of thousands of years each. The list begins with the statement that after kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. It then names 8 kings who ruled 5 Sumerian cities before the flood, with reigns ranging from 28,800 years to 43,200 years, totaling about 241,200 years of rule by these antediluvian kings. Then the flood swept over, and when kingship descended from heaven again after the flood, kingship moved to Kish, and the post-flood kings ruled for more reasonable periods, though still often measured in hundreds or low thousands of years. As the list progresses toward contemporary times, the reign lengths become more realistic, approaching the actual spans that historical kings might have ruled. Ancient astronaut theorists point to these extraordinary reign lengths as evidence that the antediluvian kings were either aliens with much longer lifespans than humans, or hybrid beings with alien genetics that granted extended longevity, or humans living under different environmental conditions before some catastrophe, possibly when Earth's atmosphere or magnetic field was different due to proximity to Nibiru or other cosmic factors. Sitchin argued that these weren't mythological exaggerations, but rather accurate records of a time when beings from Nibiru, who lived far longer than humans due to their planet's slow orbit, ruled Earth directly before eventually departing or dying off and leaving humanity to govern itself. But scholars understand the Sumerian king list in an entirely different context. It's a political document, not a historical chronicle in the modern sense. By claiming that kingship descended from heaven and that legitimate rule had passed through various cities in a sacred sequence, the list established the theological and political legitimacy of the current dynasty. It connected contemporary kings to the divine origins of monarchy, suggesting that their right to rule came from the gods through an unbroken chain of legitimate succession stretching back to the beginning of time. The impossibly long reigns of the antediluvian kings marked them as belonging to a different era, a mythological age when the world operated under different rules, when gods and humans interacted more directly, when time itself moved differently. This pattern appears in other ancient king lists and genealogies. The Hebrew Bible's genealogies in Genesis list patriarchs before the flood, who lived for hundreds of years, with Methuselah reaching 969 years. After the flood, lifespans gradually decrease until they reach normal human spans. This isn't historical biology, but rather literary convention, using lifespan to mark the transition from mythological time to historical time, from the age of direct divine involvement to the age of ordinary human existence. The Sumerian king list does the same thing, with the added political function of legitimizing royal authority by connecting it to divine origins. Ancient societies had different concepts of historical time and factual accuracy than we do. Modern history strives for documentary accuracy, for verification of events through multiple sources, for critical analysis that separates fact from legend. Ancient chronicles mixed history, mythology, political propaganda, and theological teaching into narratives that served cultural functions beyond mere record-keeping. The Sumerian king list wasn't trying to deceive anyone. It was presenting a version of the past that made sense within Mesopotamian cosmology and served the needs of royal ideology. Readers in ancient Sumer would have understood the conventions, the significance of the flood as a dividing line between ages, the meaning of extraordinarily long reigns as markers of sacred time. The flood narrative itself appears in multiple Mesopotamian sources: the Atrahasis epic, the Gilgamesh epic, the Sumerian flood myth, the Eridu Genesis, each telling similar stories with variations in detail. These narratives likely preserve cultural memory of significant flooding events in Mesopotamian history, where the flat alluvial plain between the Tigris and Euphrates was vulnerable to catastrophic floods that could devastate cities and populations. Archaeological evidence shows that several Mesopotamian cities experienced major flooding during the early 3rd millennium BCE, with flood deposits leaving layers of sediment in the archaeological record. But these were regional disasters, not global catastrophes, and they happened at different times in different places, not in a single worldwide deluge. The mythological elaboration transformed local flooding into cosmic events, stories of divine anger and judgment, of the world cleansed and renewed, of a righteous man and his family surviving to restart civilization. This mythological pattern appears across cultures, not because all cultures experience the same global flood, but because flooding is a universal natural disaster, and because the theme of destruction and renewal, of divine judgment and survival of the worthy, serves powerful narrative and theological functions. Interpreting these flood myths as historical accounts of extraterrestrial intervention, suggesting that the Anunnaki decided to destroy humanity through artificially induced flooding, and that Enki or other Anunnaki sympathetic to humans warned selected individuals to preserve the species, again strips the narratives of their actual cultural meaning while adding speculative elements that have no basis in the texts themselves. The gods in these flood narratives are thoroughly anthropomorphic and mythological. They regret their decision. They hunger when deprived of offerings. They quarrel among themselves about whether humanity should have been warned. These are literary characters in theological dramas, not alien scientists managing a planetary population. Let's turn now to the linguistic evidence, because claims about ancient astronauts often rest on unconventional interpretations of ancient languages. Sitchin claimed to be able to read Sumerian and Akkadian cuneiform, and argued that professional scholars had mistranslated or misunderstood key terms. But when actual Assyriologists, scholars who specialize in ancient Mesopotamian languages, examined Sitchin's work, they found numerous errors, mistranslations, and misunderstandings of how Sumerian grammar and vocabulary actually function. Sumerian is a language isolate, meaning it has no known relationship to any other language family, ancient or modern. This makes it challenging to understand because we can't use comparative linguistics to verify our translations, can't look at related languages to understand how certain constructions work. Instead, Sumerian had to be deciphered from scratch using bilingual texts, particularly Sumerian Akkadian dictionaries and parallel texts, where the same content appeared in both languages. Akkadian, a Semitic language related to Hebrew and Arabic, was better understood, so scholars could use Akkadian translations of Sumerian texts to figure out what the Sumerian meant. This process took decades and involved international collaboration among scholars comparing notes, testing hypotheses, and gradually building up dictionaries and grammars that could reliably translate Sumerian texts. The Pennsylvania Sumerian Dictionary Project, for example, involves scholars from multiple institutions working systematically through the entire corpus of Sumerian literature, providing detailed analysis of each term's meaning, usage, and grammatical function. This isn't guesswork or conspiracy, it's meticulous philological work subject to peer review and scholarly debate. When Sitchin claimed that Anunnaki meant those who from heaven to earth came, professional Assyriologists pointed out that this translation doesn't work grammatically. The Sumerian term appears to be a combination of elements related to An or Anu, the sky god, and terms meaning offspring or descendants. The standard translation is something like offspring of Anu, or those of royal blood referring to the divine family of the sky god. The grammatical construction doesn't support interpreting it as a description of descent from the sky in the sense of space travel. Sumerian has specific terms for heaven, sky, and coming down, and they don't combine into the way Sitchin claimed in the word Anunnaki. Similar problems appear throughout Sitchin's linguistic work. He translated Nibiru as planet of the crossing, arguing this described a planet that crossed the orbits of other planets during its elliptical journey through the solar system. But ancient Mesopotamian astronomical texts use Nibiru as a term for Jupiter, or for the point where Jupiter crosses the ecliptic, the apparent path of the sun through the constellations. It's an astronomical reference point, not a description of a rogue planet on an unusual orbit. The term doesn't appear in context that would support Sitchin's interpretation, and ancient astronomical texts that do describe planetary movements and positions don't mention any planet with the orbital characteristics Sitchin attributed to Nibiru. Sitchin's reading of the cylinder seal VA-243 provides another example of how evidence can be misinterpreted when approached with predetermined conclusions. He claimed this seal depicted the solar system with all the planets shown correctly, including Nibiru as a large planet among them. He counted 12 bodies surrounding a central sun, interpreting this as the 5 visible planets, plus Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, Earth's moon, and Nibiru. But when art historians and ancient Near Eastern specialists examined the seal, they identified the central large object as a star symbol representing a deity, probably Shamash the sun god, surrounded by various celestial bodies and symbols that don't correspond to a systematic representation of the solar system. Ancient Mesopotamian art is highly symbolic, not naturalistic or scientific in intent. Seals depicted religious scenes, mythological narratives, ritual activities, and royal imagery using conventional iconography that contemporary viewers would have understood. A star with radiating lines was a standard way to represent divinity or a deity associated with the heavens. Dots or small circles around such a figure didn't necessarily represent planets, and certainly weren't drawn to scale or in any particular order. Reading the seal as an astronomical diagram requires ignoring how Mesopotamian art actually functioned and imposing modern scientific categories onto symbolic religious imagery. The question of why professional scholars would consistently reject Sitchin's translations if they had any merit is important to address. Some alternative history proponents suggest academic conspiracy, claiming that scholars protect mainstream narratives out of institutional interests, careerism, or even deliberate suppression of truth. But this fundamentally misunderstands how academic disciplines work. Scholars advance their careers by making new discoveries, proposing novel interpretations, and overturning previous consensus with better evidence. an Assyriologist who could actually demonstrate that Sumerian texts described extraterrestrial visitors would become famous, would revolutionize the field, would likely win major prizes and recognition. Academics are competitive, often disagree with each other, publish papers criticizing colleagues' work, and engage in vigorous debates about interpretation and methodology. The idea that they would all agree to suppress revolutionary evidence about ancient aliens requires believing that thousands of scholars in dozens of countries over multiple generations have all participated in a massive conspiracy, never breaking ranks, never leaking evidence, all giving up potential fame and recognition to protect an orthodoxy. This is vastly less plausible than the simpler explanation that Sitchin's translations were simply wrong, that he made errors based on incomplete understanding of the languages, and that professional scholars rejected his work for the same reason they reject any work that doesn't meet standards of evidence and methodology. Let's consider the practical aspects of what the ancient astronaut theory actually proposes and whether it makes logical sense even on its own terms. The core claim is that the Anunnaki came to Earth from Nibiru approximately 450,000 years ago to mine gold, which they needed to save their planet's atmosphere. This immediately raises questions. If they had the technology for interstellar or interplanetary space travel, why would they need to come to Earth for gold? Any civilization capable of crossing the vast distances of space would presumably have the technology to synthesize materials, to mine asteroids which contain abundant metals including gold without the hassle of planetary gravity, or to solve their atmospheric problems through more direct engineering. Gold is relatively rare on Earth's surface because it's a heavy element that sank toward the core during planetary formation, concentrating in the deep interior. If the Anunnaki needed gold, why travel to a planet where most of it is unreachable thousands of miles below the surface, when they could mine asteroids composed of metallic elements, some of which are basically solid chunks of iron and nickel with significant precious metal content? Asteroid mining would be vastly easier than planetary mining for a spacefaring civilization. No atmosphere to deal with, no gravity well to escape, no native life to complicate operations, and no need to create a slave species to do the work. The timescale also doesn't make sense. If the Anunnaki arrived 450,000 years ago and created humans 300,000 years ago, they supposedly mined gold using their own labor for 150,000 years before deciding to create humans to take over. Why wait so long? And if they were mining for 450,000 years total, where is the evidence? Gold mines leave traces, environmental disruption, tailings, tools, processing sites. Industrial-scale mining for nearly 500,000 years would leave obvious archaeological signatures that we would have found by now, especially in Africa's gold-bearing regions where Sitchin claimed the main operations occurred. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, have only existed for about 300,000 years, and for most of that time, we lived as hunter-gatherers in small groups with stone tool technology. Agriculture only began around 12,000 years ago. Cities appeared around 6,000 years ago. If humans were created 300,000 years ago as a mining slave species, why did it take us so long to develop civilization? Why would the Anunnaki create slaves and then apparently abandon them for 290,000 years before city-states emerged in Sumer? The timeline doesn't align with what we know about human development from archaeology and genetics. The genetic evidence is particularly strong against the ancient astronaut theory. Human DNA has been fully sequenced, and we can trace our evolutionary history through genetic analysis. We share common ancestors with all other life on Earth. We can track the mutations that differentiate species. We can see how populations split and diverged over time. Our closest genetic relatives are chimpanzees, with whom we share about 98.8% of our DNA, and we can identify the specific genetic changes that occurred in the human lineage after we split from our common ancestor with chimps about 6 to 7 million years ago. These genetic changes include genes affecting brain size, bipedal locomotion, vocal anatomy, immune function, and many other traits. They're exactly the kinds of changes we'd expect from evolutionary processes operating over millions of years: gradual modifications, duplications, mutations, some beneficial, some neutral, some harmful but not fatal. There's no indication of insertion of genetic material from an unrelated source, no alien genes that don't fit within the pattern of terrestrial evolution. If the Anunnaki had genetically engineered humans by inserting their own DNA, we would expect to find genetic sequences that have no evolutionary precursors on Earth, that don't share common ancestry with other organisms, that couldn't have arisen through natural evolutionary processes. We don't find that. Every human gene has an evolutionary history that we can trace through other species. The gene for hemoglobin, the protein that carries oxygen in our blood, exists in modified forms in all vertebrates and has evolutionary precursors going back to simple oxygen-binding proteins in ancient organisms. The genes controlling our brain development are modified versions of genes that control brain development in other mammals, which in turn evolved from genes controlling nervous system development in simpler animals. There's no point where alien DNA was inserted, just continuous evolution through natural selection, mutation, and genetic drift. The fossil record confirms this evolutionary history. We have transitional fossils showing the gradual evolution of hominids from ape-like ancestors to modern humans. Australopithecus, living 4 to 2 million years ago, shows a mix of ape-like and human-like features, bipedal locomotion but small brains and more robust build. Homo habilis, around 2.5 to 1.5 million years ago, shows larger brains and the first clear evidence of stone tool use. Homo erectus, 2 million to 300,000 years ago, had even larger brains, more sophisticated tools, and spread from Africa across Eurasia. Neanderthals, our close cousins, lived in Europe and Western Asia from about 400,000 to 40,000 years ago, using complex tools, building shelters, creating art and burying their dead. Modern humans emerged in Africa around 300,000 years ago, not through sudden genetic engineering but through gradual evolution from earlier hominid species. We coexisted and interbred with Neanderthals and another species, Denisovans, when we migrated out of Africa, and most modern humans carry small amounts of Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA as evidence of this interbreeding. This is evolution in action, population splitting, adapting to different environments, occasionally meeting and exchanging genes. There's no room in this picture for alien intervention and no need for it to explain what the evidence shows. Archaeological evidence similarly contradicts the idea that humans were created as a mining slave species. The earliest evidence of mining comes from Swaziland in Africa, where hematite, an iron ore used as pigment, was mined around 40,000 years ago. Early gold mining dates to around 6,000 years ago in the Balkans and around 5,000 years ago in Egypt. These dates are thousands, not hundreds of thousands of years ago. There's no evidence of industrial-scale mining in the periods when Sitchin claimed it occurred. The stone tools we find from 300,000 years ago are simple: hand axes, scrapers, points, made by flaking stones to create sharp edges. These are hunting and gathering tools, not mining implements. If humans had been created to mine gold 300,000 years ago, we would expect to find evidence of that activity in the archaeological record. Mines, tools specific to mining and mineral processing, settlements near ore deposits, trade networks moving gold from mining sites to collection centers, something. Instead, we find evidence of hunter-gatherer lifestyles, people following animal migrations, gathering wild plants, making tools for hunting and food processing, creating art and ritual objects, living in ways that make perfect sense for naturally evolved humans, adapting to their environments through cultural and technological innovation. The transition to agriculture around 12,000 years ago, what we call the Neolithic Revolution, shows human society changing in response to environmental changes and population pressure. As the last ice age ended, climate patterns shifted, and human groups in several regions independently developed farming, domesticating plants and animals, settling in permanent villages, developing pottery and more complex tool technologies. This process happened gradually, over thousands of years, and we can trace it in detail through archaeological sites showing the slow transition from mobile hunter-gatherers to settled farmers. This transition led to population growth, which led to more complex societies, which eventually led to cities, states, writing, and civilization as we recognize it. This progression makes perfect sense as human cultural evolution, driven by changing environmental conditions, technological innovation, and social organization. It doesn't make sense if humans were created as mining slaves 300,000 years earlier. Why would the Anunnaki create miners, then watch them forget their purpose and become hunter-gatherers for 290,000 years before eventually independently developing agriculture and civilization? The ancient astronaut narrative doesn't provide a coherent explanation for the actual pattern of human development that archaeology reveals. Let's examine specific claims about Mars more closely, because the assertion that the Anunnaki maintained bases there is testable in ways that claims about Earth in the distant past are not. Mars has been extensively studied by orbiters, landers, and rovers over the past several decades. We've mapped the planet's surface in extraordinary detail, analyzed its geology, studied its atmosphere, measured its magnetic field, examined its polar ice caps, and even detected seasonal changes in atmospheric gases. If artificial structures existed on Mars, whether recent or ancient, we would have found them. The famous face on Mars in the Cydonia region was photographed by Viking 1 in 1976, the same year Sitchin published The 12th Planet. The low-resolution image showed what appeared to be a humanoid face, complete with eyes, nose and mouth, staring up from the Martian surface. This image captured public imagination and became a staple of ancient astronaut theories, cited as evidence that Mars had once been inhabited, possibly by the Anunnaki, possibly by another civilization, with the face representing either a monument or a warning. For 2 decades, the face remained mysterious because we only had that one low-resolution image from a particular angle under particular lighting conditions. But in 1998 and again in 2001, Mars Global Surveyor took high-resolution images of the Cydonia face from multiple angles and under different lighting. These images revealed the face to be a mesa, a natural rock formation shaped by erosion. From different perspectives and with better resolution, the facial features disappeared. What appeared to be eyes were depressions eroded by wind and sand. The nose was a ridge on the mesa's surface. The mouth was another erosional feature. The whole thing was pareidolia, the human tendency to see familiar patterns, especially faces in random or ambiguous stimuli. This is an important lesson in how we perceive and interpret information. The human brain is extremely good at detecting faces, so good that we see them in clouds, in toast, in rock formations. Anywhere there's a vague pattern that resembles the basic arrangement of eyes, nose, and mouth. This trait evolved because detecting faces quickly was crucial for survival, recognizing friends versus strangers, reading emotions, noticing predators or threats. But it means we're prone to false positives, seeing faces that aren't there. The face on Mars wasn't a deliberate hoax or a real artifact. It was a natural formation that happened to resemble a face under specific viewing conditions, combined with human perceptual bias. Other supposed artificial structures on Mars have been similarly debunked. Pyramids in the Cydonia region turned out to be natural hills when viewed with better resolution and from different angles. Straight lines that some interpreted as roads or canals proved to be linear features created by geological processes, faults, or erosional patterns. Geometric shapes turned out to be coincidental arrangements of natural features that didn't maintain their appearance when examined more closely. The planet Mars is geologically active enough to create interesting surface features through volcanism, erosion, tectonics, and impact cratering, and the human mind is pattern-seeking enough to see significance in arrangements that are actually random or coincidental. If the Anunnaki had built bases on Mars hundreds of thousands of years ago, what would we expect to find? Structures would need to be fairly large and robust to be useful as planetary bases. They would need to withstand the Martian environment, low temperatures, low atmospheric pressure, dust storms, ultraviolet radiation. Even if they were abandoned hundreds of thousands of years ago, they should leave traces. Mars has less erosion than Earth because it lacks liquid water and has a thin atmosphere, so structures should actually be better preserved than they would be on Earth over similar timescales. We would expect to see geometric shapes that couldn't be explained by natural processes, regular patterns in foundation layouts, material concentrations that indicated construction or industrial activity, metallic debris, possibly radiation signatures if the bases used nuclear power, disturbed regolith around landing sites, something. We photographed the entire Martian surface at resolution good enough to see objects the size of cars. We've examined specific sites with resolution down to tens of centimeters. We've driven rovers across the surface, analyzing rocks and soil. We've used radar to probe beneath the surface, looking for subsurface water ice and geological features. None of this has revealed artificial structures or evidence of past construction. The Viking landers in 1976, Pathfinder in 1997, Spirit and Opportunity starting in 2004, Phoenix in 2008, Curiosity starting in 2012, Insight in 2018, and Perseverance starting in 2021. All of these missions have studied Mars directly, collecting data about its composition, geology, atmosphere, and potential for life. They found evidence that Mars once had liquid water on its surface, that it may have had a thicker atmosphere in the past, that it undergoes seasonal changes, and that it has complex geology including volcanoes, canyons, craters, and polar ice caps. They haven't found any evidence of past or present life, let alone evidence of ancient alien bases. The search for life on Mars is serious science, and the possibility that Mars once harbored microbial life when it had surface water is considered plausible by planetary scientists. This would be a monumental discovery if confirmed, because it would indicate that life can arise independently in different locations in the same solar system, which would have profound implications for the prevalence of life in the universe. But finding ancient microbial fossils or chemical signatures of past life is completely different from finding evidence of bases built by intelligent extraterrestrials. The former would require microscopic analysis and careful exclusion of contamination. The latter should be obvious in orbital images. Proponents of the Anunnaki Mars base theory sometimes argue that space agencies like NASA know about the bases but are covering up the evidence, either because of government policy to hide extraterrestrial contact or because of directives from secret groups controlling space exploration. But this conspiracy theory faces the same problems as all such theories. It requires assuming massive coordination among thousands of people across multiple countries and decades, with perfect secrecy despite competitive international space programs that would have every incentive to expose rivals' deceptions. The Soviet space program competed with NASA throughout the Cold War. China, India, the European Space Agency, the UAE, and private companies like SpaceX all have Mars programs. They're not sharing data to cover up alien bases. They're competing for scientific discoveries and national prestige. If any mission found evidence of artificial structures, that nation would announce it immediately to claim credit for the most important discovery in human history. The idea that they are all coordinating to suppress such evidence is logically incoherent given the incentives and the complexity of maintaining such a conspiracy. Moreover, the raw data from Mars missions is publicly available. Orbital images can be accessed online by anyone who wants to examine them. Scientists around the world analyze Mars data independently, publishing papers, making discoveries, debating interpretations. The scientific process is open, competitive, and international. If structures existed in the images, someone would have noticed and publicized it, because that's how scientific fame is achieved, and because the data is accessible enough that suppression would be impossible. The geological explanation for Martian features is comprehensive and well supported. Mars formed from the same primordial solar nebula as the other planets about 4.5 billion years ago. It differentiated into core, mantle, and crust. It had volcanic activity that created massive volcanoes like Olympus Mons, the largest volcano in the solar system. It experienced impacts that created craters of all sizes, including the enormous Hellas Basin. It had water on its surface billions of years ago, creating valleys, channels, and possibly an ocean in its northern lowlands. As the planet cooled and lost its magnetic field, its atmosphere was stripped away by solar wind, the water evaporated or froze, and Mars became the cold, dry world we see today. This geological history explains the features we observe. The volcanic plains, the ancient highlands pocked with craters, the dried-up river valleys, the layered sediments and crater floors that formed when lakes dried up, the polar ice caps composed of water ice and carbon dioxide ice. No alien intervention is needed to explain any of this, just planetary science and the same geological processes that shape all terrestrial planets. Mars is fascinating precisely because it shows us what happens when a planet smaller than Earth, with less gravity and less ability to retain atmosphere, evolves over billions of years, is a natural experiment in planetary evolution, not an extraterrestrial archaeological site. Let's broaden our perspective now and examine why the ancient astronaut theory has become so culturally influential despite the lack of scientific support. Part of the answer lies in the media landscape. Books like Sitchin's Earth Chronicles series sold millions of copies and were marketed effectively, translated into dozens of languages, and positioned as bold challenges to mainstream scholarship. Television programs like Ancient Aliens brought these ideas to massive audiences, presenting alternative interpretations of archaeology and ancient history with production values, dramatic music, and compelling narratives that made the content entertaining, even when it was factually questionable. The format of these programs typically involved presenting an ancient mystery or monument, interviewing alternative theorists who propose extraterrestrial explanations, showing dramatic reconstructions of alien visitors, and generally giving far more airtime to speculative theories than to mainstream archaeological explanations. When academic archaeologists appear on these programs, their segments are usually brief, and their skeptical analyses are framed as conventional thinking being challenged by bold new ideas. This creates a false balance, suggesting that ancient astronaut theories are legitimate alternatives to mainstream archaeology, rather than fringe speculation rejected by expert consensus. Social media and internet forums have amplified these theories further, creating communities of believers who share content, discuss evidence, and reinforce each other's conclusions. Online, anyone can create content about ancient astronauts, producing videos, blog posts, podcasts, and social media threads that reach potentially millions of people without any fact-checking or peer review. Algorithms that optimize for engagement often promote controversial or sensational content because it generates views, clicks, shares, and comments. Accurate but less dramatic content from actual archaeologists often gets less visibility because it's not designed to provoke emotional reactions or confirm existing beliefs. There's also a generational component. Many people first encountered ancient astronaut theories as teenagers or young adults, at an age when questioning authority and exploring alternative worldviews feels exciting and rebellious. Ideas absorbed during this formative period can become deeply embedded, especially if they are associated with feelings of discovering hidden truth or being part of an enlightened minority who see through official narratives. This creates emotional investment in the theories that goes beyond simple evaluation of evidence. changing one's mind later, requires admitting error and giving up a comforting worldview, which is psychologically difficult even in the face of contradictory evidence. Educational factors matter too. Most people don't have specialized knowledge of ancient languages, archaeology, genetics, or planetary science. When someone with apparent credentials like Sitchin claims to have uncovered evidence that mainstream scholars missed or suppressed, non-experts don't have the tools to evaluate whether those claims are valid. The ancient astronaut theory sounds sophisticated, citing ancient texts, discussing genetics and astronomy, referencing archaeological sites. It seems like scholarship, like research, even though it doesn't follow the methodological standards that actual scholarship requires. This highlights a broader challenge in modern society. How do non-experts evaluate claims in specialized fields? In an ideal world, we would all have enough background knowledge to critically assess archaeological or scientific claims. In reality, we rely on experts. But we also know that experts can be wrong, that scientific consensus has been overturned in the past, and that institutions sometimes do suppress inconvenient truths. This creates a dilemma. How much should we trust expert consensus versus our own judgment or alternative voices? The answer isn't simple, but some principles can guide us. First, expert consensus across international academic communities is usually reliable, especially when it's based on large amounts of evidence examined by many independent researchers. Overturning such consensus requires extraordinary evidence, not just alternative interpretations of existing data. Second, when evaluating alternative theories, we should ask whether they're testable, whether they make specific predictions that could be proven wrong, and whether they engage seriously with contrary evidence rather than dismissing it as conspiracy or ignorance. Third, we should consider the track record. Ancient astronaut theories have been around for decades. If they were correct, we should have seen accumulating evidence supporting them over time, new discoveries confirming the predictions, more scholars accepting the theories as new data emerged. Instead, we've seen the opposite, as archaeological methods improved, as genetic sequencing revealed evolutionary history, as high-resolution Mars imaging became available. The evidence has consistently contradicted ancient astronaut claims rather than supporting them. The theories survive by becoming vaguer, more unfalsifiable, and more reliant on conspiracy thinking to explain away contradictory evidence. Let's consider what genuine anomalous evidence would look like and how science would respond to it. If an archaeological excavation discovered an artifact that contained materials not found on Earth, like an alloy with isotope ratios that couldn't occur naturally on our planet, there would be extraordinary evidence requiring serious investigation. Scientists would test it extensively, rule out contamination or fraud, publish the findings for peer review, and if the artifact truly appeared extraterrestrial, it would force a re-evaluation of human history. That's not what's happened because such artifacts don't exist. If genetic analysis revealed human DNA sequences that had no evolutionary precursors, that couldn't be explained through natural selection and mutation, that appeared to be artificially designed, that would be extraordinary evidence of genetic engineering. Geneticists would investigate intensively, publish the findings, and if confirmed, it would revolutionize biology. But human genetics shows exactly what we'd expect from evolution, not from alien engineering, so this hasn't happened. If Martian surface imaging revealed structures with obvious geometric regularity, with materials properties different from surrounding terrain, with features impossible to explain geologically, that would be extraordinary evidence of artificial construction. Planetary scientists would focus intense scrutiny on those structures, send missions specifically to investigate them, and if confirmed, it would be the most important discovery in space exploration history. But Mars imagery shows natural geological features, so this hasn't happened either. Science is actually very open to paradigm-shifting discoveries, as evidenced by how rapidly revolutionary ideas are accepted when properly supported by evidence. Plate tectonics, initially controversial, became consensus within 2 decades once seafloor spreading was documented. The impact theory of dinosaur extinction, once ridiculed, became accepted when the Chicxulub crater was discovered and iridium layers in rock formations confirmed global impact debris. The existence of exoplanets, once speculative, became established fact through precise stellar measurements. When evidence is strong, when it survives scrutiny, when it makes testable predictions that are confirmed, scientific consensus changes, often quite quickly. The ancient astronaut theory hasn't experienced this trajectory because it's not supported by strong evidence. It remains on the fringe not because of suppression or closed-mindedness, but because after decades of claims and investigation, the evidence doesn't support the conclusions. This is how science is supposed to work. Ideas are proposed, evidence is evaluated, and theories that don't stand up to scrutiny are set aside in favor of better explanations that fit the data. As we approach the conclusion of our exploration, it's worth reflecting on what this whole phenomenon tells us about human nature, about how we seek meaning in the world, about our relationships with mystery and authority, and about the stories we tell ourselves about our place in the cosmos. The ancient astronaut theory, despite its factual problems, speaks to something deep in human psychology, the desire to believe we're special, that we're connected to something larger than ourselves, that there are wonders and mysteries beyond what conventional wisdom acknowledges. Throughout history, humans have created myths and stories that explain our origins and give our lives cosmic significance. The Sumerian myths about the Anunnaki creating humans to serve the gods, the Genesis account of God creating humanity in his image, the Greek myth of Prometheus shaping humans from clay and stealing fire from the gods to give us technology. These narratives all address the same fundamental questions about why we exist, where we came from, and what our purpose is. The ancient astronaut theory is a modern version of these creation myths, updated for a scientific age, replacing gods with aliens, replacing divine magic with advanced technology, but serving similar psychological and cultural functions. There's nothing wrong with seeking cosmic significance or wondering about our place in the universe. These are profound questions that philosophy, theology, and science all address in different ways. The problem comes when we let our desire for certain answers override our commitment to evidence and truth, when we believe something not because it's supported by data, but because it makes us feel better, because it fits our existing worldview, or because rejecting it would require admitting we were wrong. The truth about human origins, the fact that we evolved through natural selection from earlier hominid species, that we're related to all other life on Earth through common ancestry, that we developed civilization through cultural evolution over thousands of years, this truth is actually profound and awe-inspiring. We are literally made of stardust. The atoms in our bodies forged in the hearts of dying stars billions of years ago. We are the product of nearly 4 billion years of evolution, the result of countless ancestors surviving long enough to reproduce, passing on their genes through an unbroken chain stretching back to the first living cells. We developed consciousness, language, art, science, civilization, all through our own efforts, building on what previous generations learned and created. This narrative doesn't diminish us, it elevates us. We didn't need alien intervention to achieve what we've achieved. We did it ourselves, through intelligence, creativity, cooperation, and perseverance. The Sumerians invented writing on their own. The Egyptians built the pyramids with their own ingenuity and labor. The Maya developed their calendar through astronomical observation and mathematical sophistication, all without extraterrestrial help. Recognizing this honors these civilizations and their genuine accomplishments, rather than attributing their achievements to outside intervention. The search for extraterrestrial life continues through legitimate scientific channels, and it's one of the most exciting frontiers in modern science. We're discovering thousands of exoplanets, some in the habitable zones of their stars where liquid water could exist. We're analyzing the atmospheres of these distant worlds, looking for biosignatures, chemical markers that might indicate biological processes. We're listening for signals from technological civilizations using radio telescopes and optical searches. We're exploring Mars, Europa, Enceladus, and other bodies in our own solar system that might harbor microbial life. If we discover life elsewhere, whether microbial organisms in Martian soil or intelligent signals from a distant star system, it will transform our understanding of our place in the cosmos. It will answer one of humanity's oldest and most profound questions: are we alone? But that discovery will come through science, through careful observation and rigorous analysis, through instruments and methods that can distinguish between what we hope to find and what's actually there. It won't come from reinterpreting ancient mythology or seeing artificial structures in natural rock formations. Until next time, keep wondering, keep questioning, keep seeking truth wherever it leads. But always remember that the most profound truths are the ones we can actually verify, the ones supported by evidence and reason, the ones that survive rigorous scrutiny. The cosmos is vast, history is rich, and reality is wonderful enough without needing embellishment. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.